Some places don't answer when you call them. Lake Quinault sits in a glacially carved basin on the southwestern edge of Olympic National Park, surrounded by some of the last intact temperate rainforest in North America. The lake itself is nearly 4 miles long, fed by the Quinault River and ringed by Sitka spruce and western red cedar that predate European contact. The Quinault Indian Nation has occupied this territory for thousands of years, and their oral traditions speak of the lake as a boundary place, a threshold between the known world and something older. By the mid-20th century, the area had become a center for timber operations. Logging roads carved through the surrounding wilderness, and the United States Forest Service established a network of fire lookouts and patrol routes to monitor the vast tracts of commercial forest. Helicopter surveillance became standard in the 1970s, particularly during fire season, when aerial crews would spend hours circling over the canopy watching for smoke. The lake's reputation among pilots was unremarkable. Weather could change quickly. Fog rolled in from the Pacific without warning, and the terrain made emergency landings dangerous, but it was no worse than dozens of other remote sites in the region. There were no unusual incident reports, no patterns of mechanical failure, nothing that would have suggested the area was anything other than difficult but manageable wilderness. That changed on August 14, 1987. A Forest Service Bell 206 helicopter, tail number November 73 Foxtrot Sierra, departed from the Quinault Ranger Station at 11:45 in the morning. The crew consisted of pilot Robert Aldrich, a veteran with over 3,000 flight hours, and observer Monica Vasquez, a seasonal forestry technician conducting a routine fire survey. The flight plan called for a standard patrol loop, northwest along the lake shore, then inland over the Quinault River drainage, returning by early afternoon. At 12:18, Aldrich radioed the ranger station to report their position approximately 2 miles north of the lake's eastern shore. His transmission was clear. He noted light winds, excellent visibility, and no signs of fire activity. It was the last communication the crew would remember sending. At 12:21, the ranger station received another transmission from November 73 Foxtrot Sierra. The voice was Aldrich's, but the message made no sense. He was telling himself to abort the flight. The phrasing was exact. November 73 Foxtrot Sierra. This is November 73 Foxtrot Sierra. Turn back now. Do not proceed over the lake. I repeat, turn back now. The dispatcher, a woman named Teresa Goff, responded immediately, asking Aldrich to clarify. There was no reply. She continued trying to raise the helicopter for the next 6 minutes. At 12:27, Aldrich's voice returned to the frequency, sounding confused. He reported that his radio had gone completely dead. No static, no carrier wave, nothing, and had just come back online. He asked if the station had been trying to reach him. Goff asked if he had transmitted any messages in the past 10 minutes. Aldrich said he had not. His last communication, from his perspective, had been at 12:18. He had no memory of the warning transmission, and Vasquez, listening on the intercom, confirmed the same. As far as the crew was concerned, their radios had simply stopped working for nearly 10 minutes while they circled the northern part of the lake. But the transmission had been recorded. Goff's logbook noted it. The tape archive captured it. And the voice was unquestionably Aldrich's, speaking with the same cadence, the same West Texas accent, the same call sign. Forest Service officials reviewed the incident within 48 hours. The helicopter underwent a full inspection and was found to be in perfect working order. The radio system showed no faults, no evidence of malfunction or interference. Aldrich and Vasquez were interviewed separately. Both insisted they had not transmitted anything during the silent period, and both described the same experience. The radio had cut out suddenly, as if a switch had been thrown, and returned just as abruptly, Neither had heard anything unusual on the frequency during the blackout. The recording was analyzed by communications specialists from the Federal Aviation Administration. The voice print analysis confirmed that the warning transmission was Aldrich's voice. There was no indication of tampering, no signal artifacts suggesting playback or spoofing. It was a live transmission, captured in real time from the helicopter's radio, but Aldrich had not sent it. Over the following months, 3 other flight crews reported similar experiences over Lake Quinault. In October of 1987, a private helicopter conducting a wildlife survey experienced a 7-minute radio blackout while circling the lake's western shore. The pilot, a man named Edward Petrosian, later told investigators that he heard his own voice on the intercom during the blackout, warning him to climb to a higher altitude. He had not spoken. His passenger, a biologist from the University of Washington, heard the same voice. In March of 1988, a Coast Guard helicopter on a training flight lost radio contact for 4 minutes over the northern inlet of the lake. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Marisa Keough, reported hearing a transmission in her own voice advising the crew to alter their heading 30 degrees east. She had not touched the radio controls. In June of that year, a news helicopter covering a search and rescue operation experienced a brief radio failure directly above the lake. The pilot, Dennis Harwell, stated in a later interview that he heard himself, his own voice, his own inflection, telling the crew to leave the area immediately. He described the sensation as deeply disorienting, not frightening, but wrong in a way he struggled to articulate. It wasn't like hearing a recording, he said. It was like hearing yourself think out loud, except you weren't thinking it. By 1989, the FAA had logged 9 separate incidents involving aircraft over Lake Quinault. All shared the same characteristics: temporary radio failure lasting between 3 and 12 minutes, always occurring within a 2-mile radius of the lake's center. And in each case, crew members reported hearing their own voices issuing warnings or navigational instructions they had not given. Ground stations consistently recorded these transmissions as live, real-time communications from the aircraft, even though the pilots had no memory of sending them. The pattern was clear enough that regional flight operations began quietly advising crews to avoid prolonged loitering over the lake. It was never formalized as a restricted area. There was no regulatory basis for such a designation, but the guidance was understood. If you had to fly over Quinault, you flew high and you kept moving. Scientific explanations were proposed. Atmospheric ducting, a phenomenon where radio waves bend and travel along layers of air with different temperatures, could theoretically cause signals to reflect or delay. But ducting could not explain why the voices were always the pilot's own, or why the warnings were contextually relevant to the specific flight. Temperature inversions over water were common, but none of the meteorological data from those days showed conditions unusual enough to produce such precise effects. Some researchers suggested a psychological component: stress-induced auditory hallucinations triggered by the isolation of wilderness flight and the subtle disorientation of circling over water. But that did not account for the ground recordings, which captured transmissions that the pilots insisted they never made. It also failed to explain why multiple crew members in the same aircraft heard identical warnings simultaneously. The Forest Service conducted electromagnetic surveys of the area in 1990. The results were inconclusive. There were no unusual magnetic anomalies, no underground mineral deposits that might interfere with radio signals, nothing that would create a localized dead zone. The lake itself was deep, over 300 feet in places, but sonar mapping revealed no structural features that could generate acoustic or electromagnetic interference. Incident reports after 1990 became harder to verify. Pilots who experienced the phenomenon were often reluctant to file formal reports, aware that doing so might raise questions about their fitness to fly. Some described the events only in private conversations, off the record. A helicopter paramedic who flew over the lake in 1994 said he heard his own voice telling him that someone on the ground needed help, specifying location along the southern shore. No one was there. A forestry pilot in 2001 reported a 5-minute blackout, during which he heard himself calmly explaining how to perform an emergency auto-rotation, a procedure he had not thought about in years. The Quinault Indian Nation has no official comment on the phenomenon, but some tribal members have spoken informally about the lake's reputation. One elder, interviewed by a regional journalist in 2006, described it as a place where time folds back on itself, where the boundary between what has happened and what will happen becomes uncertain. The journalist noted that the elder used the word listens to describe the lake, not that it speaks, but that it listens, and sometimes it repeats what it hears. No aircraft has crashed at Lake Quinault due to the radio anomaly. No crew has been injured. The warnings, when they occur, are always calm, always specific, and always ignored without consequence. But they continue. The most recent documented incident occurred in June of 2023. A medical transport helicopter lost radio contact for 8 minutes while flying a patient to a hospital in Aberdeen. The pilot, a woman named Sarah Lindquist, with 15 years of experience, later described hearing her own voice advising her to descend below 1,000 feet due to unexpected turbulence. The sky was clear. There was no turbulence. She did not descend. When her radio came back online, the dispatcher asked if she had been trying to reach them. She had not, but the transmission had been recorded, time-stamped, and logged. Her voice, her call sign, her warning. Lindquist no longer flies over Lake Quinault. Some places are removed so completely that even the memory of their location disappears. The Willapa Hills rise in modest, forested ridges across Pacific County in southwestern Washington, between the Columbia River and Grays Harbor. The terrain is dense with second-growth Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, broken by steep ravines and seasonal streams that swell with winter rain. In the late 19th century, this area was prime logging territory. Small mill towns appeared and vanished with the timber economy, their populations shifting as easily as the lumber they processed. Most left some trace, a foundation, a name on a survey map, a mention in county records. Bone River Station left more than that, and then it left nothing at all. The first reference appears in the 1898 Pacific County Tax Assessment Rolls. A settlement designated as Bone River Station is listed with an estimated population of 43 residents, located approximately 9 miles northeast of Raymond, near the confluence of two tributaries feeding into the Bone River watershed. The name follows the convention of the time. Small logging outposts were often named for nearby geographic features and given the suffix station to indicate a rail spur or supply depot. By 1904, the settlement had grown. That year's Federal Census Enumeration District 12 includes Bone River Station as a discrete community. 17 families are listed by name, occupation, and country of origin. Most were loggers or mill workers. Several were Finnish immigrants. 3 households included children under the age of 10. The census taker, a man named August Brenner, noted the settlement's coordinates in his field log, cross-referenced to a township and range designation that placed it in the hills east of the Bone River. The United States Postal Service assigned Bone River Station an official post office code in 1905. Mail delivery records show intermittent service through 1908, typically once per week via contracted rider from Raymond. The postmaster was listed as a man named Oskar Halonen, one of the Finnish settlers recorded in the 1904 census. In 1906, The Simpson Logging Company filed a land claim that included acreage described as adjacent to Bone River Station. The claim was approved and recorded in the Pacific County Land Office. Timber harvest reports from 1907 reference a spur line running to Bone River Depot, where cut logs were loaded for transport to coastal mills. And then the record stops. The 1910 census makes no mention of Bone River Station. The enumeration district that previously included the settlement now lists only scattered homesteads and seasonal logging camps, none matching the population or structure described 6 years earlier. The post office designation is absent from 1911 postal directories. The Simpson Logging Company's 1912 annual report describes operations in the Willapa Hills, but makes no reference to any facility or location called Bone River Station. By 1915, the name had disappeared entirely from regional maps. The anomaly went unnoticed for decades. Small settlements came and went throughout the Pacific Northwest, absorbed into larger towns or abandoned when timber resources were exhausted. It was not unusual for a place to exist briefly in official records and then fade. But Bone River Station did not simply fade, it was methodically erased. In 1973, a graduate student named Margaret Tolliver was researching early Scandinavian immigration to Washington for her thesis at the University of Washington. While reviewing Pacific County census records, she found the 1904 enumeration listing for Bone River Station. Curious, she cross-referenced it with contemporary maps and land surveys. The township and range coordinates given in the census placed the settlement in a specific area of the Willapa Hills, but when she compared those coordinates to current topographic maps, the area did not exist. Not that it was unmarked. The coordinates themselves were absent. The maps showed a discontinuity, a gap in the grid system, as if that particular 12-square-mile section had been skipped during surveying. Tolliver assumed it was a clerical error and requested the original survey plats from the Washington State Archives. The plats showed something stranger. The area had been surveyed in 1897, with township and range lines clearly marked. But a second survey conducted in 1909 showed the same region with a revised grid. The revision shifted the boundaries in a way that eliminated the original coordinates. The land was still there, but the system used to describe it had been rewritten, and in the process, Bone River Station's location ceased to correspond to any mappable place. Tolliver contacted the State Land Office for clarification. She was told that resurveys were common in the early 20th century, often to correct errors or account for geographic features that had been overlooked. But when she asked why the 1909 survey had altered coordinates rather than correcting them, she received no clear answer. The officials she spoke with suggested that the original 1897 survey might have been inaccurate, though they could not explain why it had been accepted and used for over a decade. She drove to the area in the summer of 1974, accompanied by a local historian named Edwin Krause. Using the original 1897 coordinates, they navigated as close as they could to where Bone River Station should have been. The terrain was unremarkable. Dense forest, second-growth timber, steep hillsides cut by ravines. They found no foundations, no remnants of structures, no cleared land that might indicate past habitation. Krause, who had lived in the area his entire life, said he had never heard of Bone River Station and knew of no local stories or family histories that mentioned it. Tolliver returned to the archives and began searching for any other references to the settlement. She found several. A 1905 issue of a Raymond newspaper included a brief item about a school being established at Bone River Station. A 1906 county health report mentioned an outbreak of influenza in the settlement, noting that 2 children had died. A 1907 business directory listed a general store operated by a man named Victori Makinen at Bone River Station. Each reference was clear, specific, and consistent with the others. The settlement had existed. People had lived there, worked there, sent mail, paid taxes, raised children. But when Tolliver tried to trace any of the individuals named in the records, she found nothing. Oscar Hallinan, the postmaster, did not appear in any subsequent census. Vittori Makinen, the store owner, left no probate record, no land deed, no death certificate. The families listed in the 1904 census, Lane, Koskinen, Jarvanen, Toivonen, vanished from the historical record after 1908. None appeared in later immigration records, military service rolls, or county death indexes. It was as if 17 families, 43 people, had simply stopped existing. Tolliver's thesis advisor suggested she had misread the records or confused Bone River Station with another settlement, but she had checked her sources repeatedly. The census enumeration was clear. The post office designation was documented. The logging company's land claim referenced the settlement by name. She published a brief article about her findings in a regional history journal in 1976. The response was limited. A few local historians expressed interest, but most dismissed it as a clerical oddity. Records from that era were notoriously inconsistent, and it was not unusual for small settlements to leave fragmented documentation. One archivist suggested that Bone River Station might have been an informal name, used locally but never officially recognized, which would explain why it appeared in some records but not others. But that did not explain the resurvey. Tolliver had obtained copies of both the 1897 and 1909 plats, and the changes were undeniable. The later survey had redrawn the grid in a way that erased the coordinates where Bone River Station had been located. It was not a correction. It was a deliberate alteration, removing a specific area from the system used to describe and claim land. In 1982, a Forest Service surveyor named Thomas Milliken was conducting boundary work in the Willapa Hills and came across Tolliver's article. Out of curiosity, he used GPS technology, still relatively new at the time, to plot the original 1897 coordinates for Bone River Station. The location fell within an area of commercial forest land owned by a timber company. Milliken hiked to the site and found nothing unusual, mature trees, undergrowth, typical topography for the region, but when he checked the GPS readings against the official land survey maps, he noticed the same discontinuity Tolliver had described. The coordinates existed in the old system, but had no equivalent in the current one. Milliken mentioned this to a colleague, who suggested he contact the Washington Department of Natural Resources. He did, and was told that the discrepancy was likely due to datum shifts, changes in the reference systems used for mapping over time. But datum shifts affected entire regions, not isolated 12-square-mile sections, and they did not explain why a documented settlement with a post office, census entry, and commercial activity would disappear so completely. No government agency has conducted a formal investigation. The Pacific County Historical Society acknowledges that Bone River Station appears in some early records but has no artifacts, photographs, or oral histories related to it. Attempts to locate descendants of the families listed in the 1904 census have been unsuccessful. Immigration records for Finnish settlers in Washington during that period include many of the surnames associated with Bone River Station: Hallinan, Makinen, Lane, but none can be definitively linked to the settlement. The land where Bone River Station should have existed remains privately owned, forested, and unremarkable. No archaeological surveys have been conducted there, and no physical evidence of prior habitation has been reported. The most recent inquiry came in 2018, when a genealogist researching Finnish immigration contacted the Pacific County Auditor's Office asking for records related to a man named Oscar Hallinan, listed as postmaster of Bone River Station in 1905. The auditor's office replied that they had no record of anyone by that name and no record of a post office at that location. The genealogist provided copies of the original postal designation and the census entry. The auditor's office acknowledged the documents, but stated that they could not verify their accuracy or explain the discrepancies. The settlement existed long enough to be counted, taxed, and mapped. And then it was methodically removed, not by fire, flood, or economic collapse, but by the quiet revision of the records that proved it had ever been there. There are things in the forest that move only when you do. The Hoh River Trail cuts through one of the wettest places in the continental United States, winding 17 miles into the heart of Olympic National Park's temperate rainforest. Annual rainfall exceeds 14 feet in some areas, creating an ecosystem dense with Sitka spruce, big-leaf maple draped in moss, and ferns that grow as tall as a person. The trail follows the river valley eastward toward the base of Mount Olympus, passing through old-growth forest that has remained largely unchanged for centuries. The Hoh people, a band of the Quinault Indian Nation, have inhabited this region for thousands of years. Their oral traditions describe the river valley as a place of transformation, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual world is thin. European explorers arrived in the late 19th century, followed by loggers and eventually the establishment of Olympic National Park in 1938. The trail itself was constructed by the Civilian Conservation Corps and has been a popular backcountry route since the mid-20th century. Weather conditions on the trail can change rapidly. Fog rolls in from the Pacific and settles into the valley, reducing visibility to a few dozen feet. The dense canopy blocks most direct sunlight, even on clear days. And the moss-covered forest floor absorbs sound, creating an unusual acoustic quality that hikers often describe as oppressive or disorienting. These factors are well documented and considered normal for the environment. What is not normal is the light. The first documented report came in May of 1994. A group of 3 hikers, Laura Finch, David Strand, and Catherine Owens, were 4 miles into the trail, returning from an overnight trip to Glacier Meadows. It was mid-afternoon, overcast, but with good visibility. Finch later told a park ranger that she noticed something pale and luminous in her peripheral vision, slightly to the left of the trail, perhaps 30 feet away through the trees. When she turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. She dismissed it and kept walking. A few minutes later, she saw it again. Same position, same distance, same pale glow. This time, she stopped and stared at the spot for several seconds. Nothing. But as soon as she resumed walking and looked forward, the light reappeared at the edge of her vision. Finch mentioned it to her companions. Strand said he had noticed something similar, but assumed it was sunlight reflecting off wet moss. Owens confirmed she had seen it too, always in the same relative position, always disappearing when she tried to focus on it directly. They tested it by stopping and starting repeatedly. Each time they walked, the light was there. Each time they stopped, it vanished. The group hiked the remaining 4 miles to the trailhead without further incident, though all 3 reported seeing the light intermittently throughout. Finch filed a written report with the Olympic National Park Wilderness Office 3 days later, primarily out of curiosity. The ranger who received the report, a man named Gregory Tatum, noted it in the logbook but did not pursue any follow-up. Strange visual phenomena in dense forest were not uncommon: reflections, mist, optical illusions caused by fatigue. But the reports continued. In August of 1995, a solo hiker named Michael Brennan described an identical experience. He was approximately 6 miles into the trail when he noticed a pale light tracking him through the forest. It stayed to his right, maintaining a consistent distance of what he estimated to be 20 to 30 feet. When he stopped, it disappeared. When he walked, it returned. Brennan was an experienced outdoorsman and former military, familiar with night vision equipment and optical illusions. He stated in his report that the light did not behave like any natural phenomenon he recognized. In October of 1996, a family of 4, Thomas and Ellen Kowalski and their 2 teenage children, encountered the light near mile marker 5. All 4 members saw it simultaneously, always in peripheral vision, always vanishing when observed directly. Thomas Kowalski attempted to photograph it using a film camera, but when the photos were developed, they showed only trees and undergrowth. By 2000, the Olympic National Park Wilderness Office had received 9 separate reports, all describing the same phenomenon. The light was pale, diffuse, and always positioned slightly behind or to the side of the observer. It appeared only when the witness was moving and disappeared when they stopped or turned to look at it. It did not flicker, pulse, or change intensity. It simply tracked. Rangers began asking follow-up questions. Was the light visible on cloudy days? Yes. Was it visible at different times of day? Yes, though most reports came from afternoon hikes. Did it appear in the same location on the trail? No. Witnesses encountered it at various points between mile markers 3 and 9. Did it follow individuals or groups? Both. The only consistent variable was movement. The light appeared when people walked and vanished when they stopped. A wildlife biologist named Dr. Evelyn Summerby reviewed the reports in 2002 as part of a broader study on visitor experiences in Olympic National Park. She noted that the witnesses came from diverse backgrounds: experienced hikers, casual visitors, families, solo travelers, and none had prior knowledge of similar reports. Their descriptions were remarkably consistent despite being separated by years. Summerby suggested the phenomenon might be a form of Troxler's fading, a visual effect where peripheral stimuli disappear when a person focuses on a fixed point. But Troxler's fading typically causes objects to vanish from peripheral vision, not appear there. And it did not explain why the light seemed to track movement. Other explanations were proposed. Bioluminescent fungi exist in Pacific Northwest forests, though they are rare and typically emit only faint glows visible in complete darkness. Reflections from water or wet surfaces can create illusions of light, but these are usually momentary and positional, not sustained and tracking. Atmospheric phenomena such as will-o'-the-wisps, swamp gases igniting, were geographically inappropriate for the Hoh River Trail, which has no marshland or stagnant water. In 2007, a group of graduate students from the University of Washington hiked the trail with the intention of documenting the light. They brought cameras, light meters, and electromagnetic field detectors. 3 of the 5 students reported seeing the light at different points along the trail. Their equipment registered no anomalies, no unusual electromagnetic readings, no light sources detectable by the meters, and no images captured on film or digital media. One student, a woman named Alicia Reyes, described the experience as profoundly unsettling, not because of fear, but because of the precision with which the light maintained its distance. It felt aware, she said in a later interview, not intelligent exactly, but responsive, like it was calibrated to us. Park officials have never issued warnings or restrictions related to the light. No injuries have been reported in connection with it, and no hikers have gone missing under circumstances that could be linked to the phenomenon. The trail remains one of the most popular routes in Olympic National Park, attracting thousands of visitors annually. Most experience nothing unusual. But the reports persist. Between 2010 and 2023, the Park Service documented 8 additional incidents. Each followed the same pattern. A hiker or group of hikers would notice a pale light in their peripheral vision. It would track them for anywhere from a few minutes to several miles. When they stopped or turned to look, it disappeared. When they resumed walking, it returned. In 2015, a ranger named Joel Martinson was conducting a routine trail maintenance inspection when he encountered the light himself. He was alone, approximately 7 miles in, clearing fallen branches from the path. He saw it to his left, pale and steady, keeping pace with him as he worked his way back toward the trailhead. Martinson stopped several times to observe it directly. Each time, it vanished. He did not file a formal report but mentioned the experience to colleagues, describing it as unsettling in its consistency. The most recent documented case occurred in June of 2023. A group of 6 hikers, all members of a Seattle-based outdoor club, reported seeing the light near mile marker 8. They tested it systematically, with some members stopping while others continued walking. Those who kept moving saw the light. Those who stopped did not. When the entire group halted, the light disappeared. When they all resumed walking, it returned, positioned equidistant from the group, visible only to those at the edges. One member of the group, a software engineer named Priya Nadkarni, later described the experience in an online hiking forum. She noted that the light seemed to maintain a radius rather than a fixed position. It adjusted its location based on the group's formation, always staying at the periphery, always just out of direct sight. It wasn't following us, she wrote. It was orbiting us. Olympic National Park has no official explanation for the phenomenon. The Wilderness Office continues to log reports when they are submitted, but no investigation has been conducted. Rangers are trained to acknowledge visitor concerns without offering speculation, and the light is not mentioned in any park literature or safety briefings. The Hoh River Trail remains open. Hikers walk it every day, moving through the moss-covered silence, accompanied, sometimes, by something that matches their pace exactly, staying always at the edge of vision, vanishing the moment they turn to see it clearly. Some records are kept in places no one was meant to find them. Cape Flattery forms the northwesternmost point of the contiguous United States, a wind-battered promontory of basalt and sandstone jutting into the Pacific Ocean. The land belongs to the Makah Nation, who have occupied this coast for over 4,000 years. The terrain is rugged, sea stacks rise from churning water, and the cliffs are honeycombed with caves accessible only at low tide. The area receives over 100 inches of rain annually, and winter storms produce waves that reshape the coastline with each season. The Spanish explorer Bruno de Heceta charted the cape in 1775, naming it Cabo de Santa Clara, though the name did not persist. British Captain James Cook arrived 3 years later and renamed it Cape Flattery, noting the flattering appearance of a harbor that proved too dangerous to enter. Russian fur traders occasionally stopped along this coast in the early 19th century, and American merchant vessels began arriving in the 1830s. The Makah maintained control of the territory throughout, trading with outsiders but permitting no permanent settlements. The caves beneath the cape were used for various purposes: shelter during storms, storage, ceremonial sites. Most are documented in Makah oral tradition, but some are not. In July of 1997, a marine geologist named Brendan Sutherland was conducting a coastal erosion study along Cape Flattery. He was working with permission from the Makah Tribal Council, documenting changes in the cliff face caused by tidal action and storm surges. On the morning of July 16th, during an exceptionally low tide, Sutherland accessed a sea cave on the north side of the cape that he had not been able to enter on previous visits. The cave extended roughly 40 feet into the cliff, tapering to a narrow passage at the rear. The walls were wet basalt, slick with algae and barnacles below the high tide line. Sutherland was photographing erosion patterns when he noticed something unusual. A section of wall above the waterline, approximately 6 feet from the cave mouth, covered in carved marks. They were tally marks, vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, the 5th line crossing diagonally. Hundreds of them, arranged in neat columns across a 10-foot section of stone. Sutherland photographed the markings and noted their location in his field journal. He assumed they were relatively recent, possibly left by fishermen or beachcombers counting days or catches. But when he examined the photographs more closely that evening, he realized the marks were far older than he had thought. The grooves were weathered, filled with mineral deposits consistent with decades, possibly centuries, of exposure to salt air and tidal spray. Some were nearly eroded away, barely visible even in direct light. Sutherland returned to the cave 3 days later with Dr. Helena Ruiz, a colleague specializing in coastal archaeology. They documented the marks systematically, taking measurements and close-up photographs. Ruiz estimated the carvings covered a time span of at least 50 years based on erosion patterns. The deepest, most weathered marks were at the left side of the wall. The fresher marks were toward the right, though even those showed significant aging. And then the marks stopped, abruptly, midway through a column, as if whoever had been making them had simply ceased. Below the final tally mark, carved in a different style, deeper, less uniform, was a phrase in Spanish, "Ya no vienen," they no longer come. Sutherland and Ruiz contacted the Macau Cultural and Research Center to report their findings. The center's director, a historian named Virginia Green, visited the cave with a tribal elder named Thomas Pascal. Pascal examined the marks, but said he had no knowledge of them. The cave itself was known, occasionally used by hunters waiting out weather, but he had never heard stories about the carvings. Green photographed the Spanish phrase and later confirmed that the style of lettering was consistent with early 19th century colonial script, likely dating to between 1810 and 1830. The question was immediate: who had made the marks, and what were they counting? The placement of the cave made regular access difficult. It was only reachable during the lowest tides of the month, and even then, the approach required careful timing to avoid being trapped by rising water. The carvings were positioned above the high tide line, indicating whoever made them understood the tidal patterns and intended the marks to be permanent. Ruiz arranged for radiocarbon dating of organic material trapped in the grooves of the carvings. The results, completed in early 1998, were startling. The oldest marks dated to approximately 1720. The newest, those nearest the Spanish phrase, dated to approximately 1823. Over 100 years of methodical record-keeping interrupted suddenly and replaced by a message in a language that should not have been there. Spanish exploration of the Pacific Northwest coast was sporadic. Bruno de Heceta's expedition in 1775 had been brief, with no recorded landings at Cape Flattery. There were no documented Spanish settlements in the area, no missions, no permanent outposts. Russian and British vessels were far more common along this stretch of coast. The presence of a Spanish inscription in a cave, accessible only to someone intimately familiar with the tidal patterns, was deeply anomalous. Ruiz contacted linguistic historians at the University of Washington. They confirmed that the phrase "ya no vienen" was grammatically correct colonial-era Spanish, meaning "they no longer come" or "they come no more." The phrasing suggested an observation or lament, not a command or warning. It implied that something or someone had been arriving regularly and had stopped. The tally marks themselves were counted. There were approximately 2,300 individual marks, grouped into sets of 5. If each mark represented a single occurrence of whatever was being counted, the record spanned over a century of observations. But observations of what? Theories emerged quickly. Some researchers suggested the marks were left by a shipwrecked Spanish sailor counting days of isolation. But the time span was too long. No individual could have survived alone for over a century, and the erosion dating confirmed the marks were made gradually over that period, not all at once. Others proposed that the marks were made by multiple people, perhaps Meca individuals, who had learned Spanish from traders. But tribal records contained no references to Spanish language use in the 18th or early 19th centuries, and Pascal insisted that if such a practice had existed, some memory of it would have persisted in oral tradition. A maritime historian named Dr. Felix Ibarra suggested the marks might be related to whaling. Gray whales migrated along the coast twice annually, and the Maka had a long tradition of whale hunting. Perhaps the marks counted whale sightings or successful hunts. But Maka whaling records, both oral and later written, used different methods of accounting and made no mention of cave-based tallies, and the Spanish phrase did not fit. Why would someone write, "They no longer come" in Spanish if they were counting whales? Ruiz returned to the cave multiple times over the next 2 years, documenting the site in greater detail. She found no other inscriptions, no additional markings, no artifacts left behind. The cave was empty except for the carvings. In 2000, she published a paper in the Journal of Pacific Northwest Archaeology describing the findings and calling for further research. The response was limited. A few academics expressed interest, but most dismissed the site as a curiosity, probably the work of an eccentric trader or a lone individual with access to the coast. The Spanish phrase was difficult to explain, but the Pacific Northwest in the 18th and early 19th centuries had been a chaotic mix of cultures and languages. Anomalies were not uncommon. But one detail troubled Ruiz. The tally marks were not random. They followed a pattern. She had initially assumed they were continuous, one mark added each day or each week, accumulating over decades. But when she analyzed the erosion data more carefully, she noticed something else. The marks occurred in clusters. Groups of marks would appear in close succession, showing similar weathering, followed by gaps, sections of wall with no marks at all, then another cluster. It suggested that whatever was being counted did not occur regularly. It came in waves, periods of frequent activity, then nothing, then activity again. The pattern repeated over the course of a century, until 1823, when it stopped entirely. Ruiz contacted a statistician to analyze the spacing and clustering of the marks. The results, published in a follow-up paper in 2003, showed a rough periodicity. Clusters appeared approximately every 7 to 9 years, with intervals of inactivity between them. The pattern was not precise, but it was consistent enough to suggest intentionality. Someone was recording arrivals, not days. In 2007, a team from the Maka Nation's Cultural Preservation Office conducted a comprehensive survey of caves along Cape Flattery, hoping to find similar markings elsewhere. They found none. The Counting Cave, as it had come to be called, was unique. The site remains accessible only during extreme low tides. The Maka Tribal Council has not restricted access, but it discourages visits due to safety concerns. The carvings have been photographed extensively, and casts were made of several sections for archival purposes. No new marks have appeared, and the Spanish phrase remains exactly as it was found: faint, weathered, but legible. In 2015, a linguist named Dr. Amelia Strand proposed a different interpretation of "ya no vienen." She noted that in certain regional dialects of colonial Spanish, the phrase could carry a secondary meaning, not just "they no longer come," but "they no longer arrive from the sea." It was a subtle distinction, but it suggested a maritime context. Something had been arriving by water regularly over the course of a century. And then it had stopped. No one has determined what was being counted. No records from Spanish, Russian, British, or American sources mention regular visits to Cape Flattery during that period. Maka oral histories describe contact with various outsiders, but nothing matching the pattern suggested by the marks. The cave remains as it was found. The tally marks continue to erode, slowly becoming illegible. In another century, they will likely be gone entirely, erased by salt and time, but the Spanish phrase, carved deeper, will last longer. A final note left by someone who had been watching for something that, one day, simply stopped coming. Some warnings arrived decades after they were needed. Hurricane Ridge sits at 5,240 feet above sea level in the heart of Olympic National Park, 17 miles south of Port Angeles, Washington. The ridge offers panoramic views of the Olympic Mountains to the south and the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the north. The area receives heavy snowfall, averaging 400 inches annually, and remains accessible by road only from late spring through early autumn. The Visitor Center, built in 1958, serves as a staging point for hikers, skiers, and tourists seeking high-altitude wilderness access. The ridge's name comes from its exposure to powerful winds that sweep in from the Pacific, creating weather conditions that can shift from clear skies to whiteout conditions within minutes. The National Park Service has maintained a weather station there since the 1960s, and the road to the ridge is frequently closed due to snow, ice, or high winds. Despite its popularity, the area retains a reputation for sudden danger. Hikers have been caught in unexpected storms, and several fatalities have occurred over the decades due to exposure or falls from icy trails. The ridge has no unusual history of radio interference. Communication equipment functions normally, and cell phone coverage, while limited, is consistent with other high-elevation areas in the park. There are no military installations nearby, no broadcast towers on the ridge itself, and no known sources of electromagnetic interference. Until June 14, 2003, it was a Saturday, clear and warm, with light winds, ideal conditions for visitors. The parking lot at Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center was nearly full by mid-morning. Families, day hikers, and photographers had driven up from Port Angeles to enjoy the views and explore the trails. Among them were Robert and Susan Cartwright, a couple from Tacoma visiting the park for the weekend. At approximately 11:32 in the morning, Susan Cartwright was sitting in their car in the parking lot, waiting for her husband to return from the restroom. The car radio was on, tuned to a public radio station out of Seattle. She later told investigators that the station cut out suddenly, no static, no fade, just silence, and was replaced by a different broadcast. The voice was male, calm, and formal. The audio quality was poor, with a hollow, slightly distorted tone that reminded her of old recordings from the 1940s or 50s. The speaker was delivering what sounded like a civil defense announcement. The message began mid-sentence. Atmospheric displacement has been confirmed in grid sections 47 through 51. Residents are advised to remain below treeline until the air settles. Do not attempt to ascend to elevated positions. Repeat, remain below treeline. This is not a test. The broadcast continued for approximately 90 seconds, repeating the same warning, with minor variations. It referenced grid sections, atmospheric displacement, and elevated positions, using phrasing that Susan described as bureaucratic and strangely archaic. The voice never identified the broadcasting station, the date, or the nature of the emergency. It simply repeated the warning, then stopped. The radio returned to the Seattle station as if nothing had happened. Susan mentioned the broadcast to her husband when he returned. He had not heard it. They assumed it was some kind of emergency alert test, possibly related to forestry or avalanche monitoring, and thought nothing more of it. But Susan Cartwright was not the only person who heard the broadcast. Over the next 2 hours, at least 29 other visitors to Hurricane Ridge reported hearing the same message on their car radios. The reports came from different vehicles, different radio models, and different frequencies. Some had been tuned to FM stations, others to AM. A few had been listening to CDs, and their players had inexplicably switched to radio mode and picked up the broadcast. In every case, the message was identical. A calm male voice warning about atmospheric displacement and advising people to remain below treeline. One witness, a man named Gregory Tompkins from Eugene, Oregon, recorded the final 30 seconds of the broadcast on a handheld cassette recorder he had been using to document bird calls. He later provided the tape to park officials. The recording was poor quality, but the voice and phrasing matched the descriptions given by other witnesses. The message ended abruptly, mid-word, as if the transmission had been cut. By early afternoon, visitors were discussing the broadcast at the visitor center. A park ranger named Lisa Yamamoto heard about it and began informally interviewing witnesses. She quickly realized that the accounts were remarkably consistent. The broadcast had occurred between 11:30 and 11:45 in the morning. It had lasted approximately 90 seconds. It had interrupted regular programming on multiple frequencies, and it had delivered the same warning to everyone who heard it. Yamamoto contacted the Olympic National Park Communications Office in Port Angeles. They had no record of any emergency broadcast, no planned tests, and no explanation for the incident. She was advised to file a formal report and forward any recordings or witness statements. The Federal Communications Commission was contacted within 48 hours. An investigator named Donald Schreiber reviewed the case and requested copies of the Tompkins recording along with detailed witness accounts. The FCC's initial analysis determined that the broadcast had occurred on a frequency that was not licensed for use in Washington state. The frequency was within a range typically reserved for aeronautical navigation, but no aircraft in the area at the time had transmitted anything matching the content of the message. Schreiber interviewed 12 witnesses personally, including the Cartwrights, Tompkins, and several families who had been in the parking lot that morning. Their descriptions aligned. The voice was male, middle-aged, with a neutral American accent. The phrasing was formal and repetitive. The term atmospheric displacement was used multiple times, along with references to grid sections and the instruction to remain below treeline. One witness, a retired broadcast engineer named Harold Voss, noted that the audio quality suggested the message was either very old or had been transmitted through outdated equipment. He described the sound as having a narrow-band compression, typical of broadcasts from the 1940s and 50s before modern FM stereo standards were introduced. But that made no sense. Such a signal could not have overridden contemporary FM broadcasts without extremely high power, and no such transmission source existed anywhere near Hurricane Ridge. The FCC expanded its investigation. They reviewed transmission logs from all licensed broadcasters in western Washington. None had aired anything resembling the message. They checked military frequencies, aviation bands, and emergency alert systems. Nothing matched. They contacted the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the United States Geological Survey, and the Department of Defense. No agency had issued warnings about atmospheric displacement, nor did any agency use that specific terminology in their protocols. The recording provided by Tompkins was analyzed by audio forensic specialists. The voice was determined to be human, not synthesized. The background noise suggested an indoor environment, possibly a small room with minimal acoustic treatment. There were no identifying sounds, no traffic, no machinery, no clues as to where or when the recording had been made. The phrasing, "This is not a test," was consistent with civil defense broadcasts from the Cold War era, but those messages had not been used since the 1980s, and none had ever mentioned atmospheric displacement. Schreiber's final report, filed in August of 2003, concluded that the broadcast had occurred but could not be explained. The FCC had no record of the frequency being used, no evidence of illegal transmission, and no plausible source for the signal. The case was classified as an unresolved incident and archived. Park officials at Hurricane Ridge were left with no answers. Yamamoto interviewed additional witnesses over the following weeks, hoping to find inconsistencies or alternative explanations. She found none. Everyone who had heard the broadcast described it the same way. It had been real, it had been clear, and it had been unsettling in its specificity. One detail troubled Yamamoto more than others. The message had instructed people to remain below treeline. Hurricane Ridge sits well above treeline. The visitor center parking lot, where all the witnesses had been located, is surrounded by alpine meadows with scattered subalpine fir, the upper limit of tree growth in the area. The instruction to stay below treeline implied that the broadcast was meant for people at even higher elevations, people who were already above the safe zone. But there had been no one higher on the ridge that morning. The trails were still partially snow-covered, and no permits had been issued for backcountry travel in the higher elevations. The parking lot had been the highest concentration of people in the area. In 2005, a linguist named Dr. Patricia Aldridge reviewed transcripts of the broadcast as part of a research project on Cold War-era civil defense messaging. She noted that the phrasing was consistent with protocols used by the Civilian Defense Office in the late 1940s, particularly the emphasis on grid sections and specific geographic instructions. But the term atmospheric displacement did not appear in any civil defense manual she had reviewed. It was not a recognized meteorological term, not a military designation, and not part of any emergency response vocabulary she could identify. Aldridge suggested that the message might have been a fragment of a discontinued test broadcast, somehow transmitted decades after it was recorded. But that did not explain how it had overridden multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, or why it had been heard only at Hurricane Ridge and nowhere else in the region. In 2011, a journalist named Marcus Delgado revisited the incident for a regional magazine article on unexplained events in the Pacific Northwest. He tracked down several of the original witnesses, including Gregory Tompkins, who still had the cassette recording. Tompkins played it for Delgado. The voice was calm, almost detached, delivering the warning with the measured cadence of a bureaucrat reading from a script. Delgado submitted the recording to a digital audio lab for enhancement. The lab isolated background sounds that had not been audible in earlier analyses. Beneath the voice, barely perceptible, was a low hum, consistent with electrical interference or mechanical vibration. The frequency of the hum did not match any known broadcast equipment, and the lab could not determine its source. No similar broadcast has been reported at Hurricane Ridge since 2003. The FCC closed its file on the incident in 2006, noting that while the event had been documented and witnessed by multiple credible sources, no explanation could be determined and no further investigation was warranted. The Tompkins recording remains the only physical evidence. It is 30 seconds of a calm male voice warning about something called atmospheric displacement, advising people to stay below treeline, insisting that it is not a test. The message was never repeated. The frequency has remained silent, and no one has ever determined who broadcast the warning or why it was needed that particular morning on a clear, calm day at the top of Hurricane Ridge. Some things return with a precision that nature cannot explain. Kalaloch Beach occupies a 6-mile stretch of coastline on the western edge of Olympic National Park, where the Pacific Ocean meets dense coastal forest. The beach is wide and exposed, composed of coarse sand, smooth stones, and an ever-changing accumulation of driftwood deposited by winter storms. Tides along this section of coast are dramatic, with a vertical range exceeding 12 feet, and the currents are powerful enough to move logs weighing several tons. The area has been part of Olympic National Park since 1938 and remains relatively undeveloped. A campground, a small lodge, and scattered access points serve visitors year-round. Driftwood is a defining feature of the Washington coast. Massive logs, some over 100 feet long, wash ashore during storm season, stripped of bark and branches by months or years of tumbling in the surf. They pile in chaotic tangles above the high tide line, creating a constantly shifting landscape. Most pieces remain on the beach for months or years before being reclaimed by the ocean or buried by sand. There is no pattern to their arrival. Storms are unpredictable, tides vary, and the ocean moves wood according to conditions that change daily. Except at Kalaloch Beach, where one piece of driftwood returns like clockwork. The first documented occurrence was in February of 1984. A National Park Service ranger named Vincent Holloway was conducting a routine beach patrol when he noticed an unusually large log positioned near the midpoint of Kalaloch Beach, approximately half a mile south of the campground. The log was remarkable for its size and condition, 41.3 feet long, 6.2 feet in diameter, and nearly perfectly cylindrical. The surface was smooth, weathered gray, with no bark remaining. What caught Holloway's attention were the holes. The log had been drilled with precise, evenly spaced boreholes running along its length. 19 holes in total, each approximately 4 inches in diameter, spaced exactly 19 inches apart. The holes were clean, uniform, and appeared to have been made with industrial equipment. Holloway assumed the log was a remnant of some maritime construction, a pier piling, part of a dock, or logging equipment from decades past. He photographed it, noted its location in his daily report, and moved on. By April, the log was gone. Holloway assumed it had been reclaimed by high tides or buried by shifting sand. He thought nothing more of it. 7 years later, in February of 1991, the log reappeared. A park visitor named Diane Kelso was walking the beach on the morning of February 10th when she found the log in almost exactly the same location Holloway had documented in 1984. She recognized it immediately, not because she had seen it before, but because it was so distinct. The measurements, the holes, the smooth cylindrical shape. She took photographs and mentioned it to a ranger at the visitor center. The ranger, a woman named Angela Pritchard, checked the park's records and found Holloway's report from 1984. The measurements matched: 41.3 feet long, 6.2 feet in diameter, 19 boreholes spaced 19 inches apart. The log had returned to the same section of beach in the same orientation during the same week of February, exactly 7 years later. Pritchard flagged the incident as unusual and forwarded her findings to the park's Resource Management Office. No action was taken. Driftwood moved unpredictably along the coast, and while the log's reappearance was curious, it was not considered significant enough to warrant investigation. By May of 1991, the log was gone again. In February of 1998, it returned. This time, multiple witnesses documented its arrival. A group of beachcombers, including a retired engineer named Martin Vecchio, found the log on February 9th. Vecchio measured it carefully, using a tape measure and calipers. The dimensions were identical to the previous reports: 41.3 feet long, 6.2 feet in diameter, 19 bore holes spaced 19 inches apart. Vecchio noted that the log showed no signs of recent disturbance, no fresh barnacles, no algae, no indication that it had been submerged or rolled by waves. It appeared dry, weathered, and settled as if it had been there for weeks, but it had not been there the week before. Vecchio had walked the same section of beach on February 2nd and was certain the log had not been present. He reported his findings to park officials and provided detailed photographs and measurements. The Olympic National Park Resource Management Office began reviewing historical records. They confirmed 3 documented appearances, 1984, 1991, and 1998. Each occurrence had taken place in early February. Each log had been found in the same approximate location, a 500-foot section of beach south of Kalaloch Campground, and each log had been identical in size and configuration. A coastal geologist named Dr. Rebecca Strand was consulted. She reviewed the reports and visited the site in March of 1998. The log was gone by then, but she examined the beach profile and tidal patterns. Strand noted that the location where the log appeared was typical for large driftwood deposition, above the high tide line, in a zone where storm waves could deposit debris but not immediately reclaim it. She suggested that the log might be caught in a longshore current system, circulating along the coast and being redeposited in the same location every 7 years due to a combination of tidal cycles and storm patterns. But the theory had problems. Longshore currents did not operate on 7-year cycles. Storm patterns were irregular, and even if the log were circulating in a predictable current, it would show signs of continuous movement, barnacle growth, wood degradation, changes in shape or size. The log appeared unchanged each time it was found, as if it had been carefully stored and replaced. In February of 2005, the log returned again. By this time, word had spread among regular visitors to Kalaloch Beach. A small group of people, including Vescio and several local residents, gathered on the beach during the second week of February, waiting to see if the log would appear. On the morning of February 11th, it was there. No one had seen it arrive. The beach had been walked the previous evening, and the log had not been present. By dawn, it was positioned in the same location, with the same measurements, with the same 19 boreholes spaced exactly 19 inches apart. Vescio contacted a marine archaeologist named Dr. Helen Ortega, who specialized in timber analysis. Ortega visited the site and took core samples from the log. Her analysis, completed in April of 2005, identified the wood as Douglas fir, consistent with timber from the Pacific Northwest. Radiocarbon dating suggested the tree had been harvested sometime in the early to mid-20th century, likely between 1920 and 1950. The boreholes had been made with industrial drill bits, probably during construction of a pier or dock. But Ortega could not explain why the log returned every 7 years, or how it maintained such precise placement and condition. The Olympic National Park Service issued a brief internal memo in 2006 acknowledging the pattern and recommending that future occurrences be documented but not publicized. The memo noted that the phenomenon had attracted minor media attention and could become a distraction if overemphasized. Rangers were instructed to log sightings but to avoid speculation when speaking with visitors. In February of 2012, the log appeared for the 5th documented time. A photographer named Jonathan Ruiz had been monitoring the beach daily since February 1st, hoping to capture the log's arrival. On the morning of February 12th, it was there. Ruiz had photographed the same section of beach the previous afternoon. The log had not been present. He checked his images carefully. No shadows, no shapes, no indication of the log in any frame taken before dawn on February 12th. By 7:30 in the morning, it was fully visible, positioned above the tide line, dry and settled. Ruiz published his photographs online, accompanied by a detailed timeline. The images showed the beach empty on February 11th and the log clearly present on February 12th. No storm had occurred. No unusually high tide had been recorded. Weather conditions had been calm, with light winds and minimal wave activity. The post attracted attention from several oceanographers and coastal scientists. One researcher, Dr. Miles Jacobson from the University of Washington reviewed the tidal and current data for the Kalaloch area. He confirmed that there was no natural mechanism that would cause a piece of driftwood to appear in the same location on a 7-year cycle. Tides operated on daily and monthly cycles. Ocean currents shifted seasonally. There was no known environmental factor that aligned with the pattern. Jacobson suggested that human intervention was the most likely explanation. Someone was deliberately placing the log on the beach every 7 years. But that raised further questions. Who would do this? Why? And how could they do it without being observed? Kalaloch Beach is not isolated. The campground is occupied year-round, and the beach is walked daily by visitors and rangers. Moving a log 41 feet long and weighing an estimated 3,000 pounds would require heavy equipment, a truck, a crane, or at minimum a large trailer and winch. No one had reported seeing such equipment. No tire tracks had been found in the sand. No witnesses had come forward. The National Park Service declined to investigate further. In a statement issued in 2013, officials acknowledged that a large piece of driftwood appeared periodically on Kalaloch Beach and that the pattern had been documented, but they offered no explanation and indicated that the matter was not considered a priority for resource management. In 2019, the log did not appear. Observers, including Vescio and Ruiz, monitored the beach throughout February. They found nothing. The expected location remained empty. Some suggested the pattern had finally broken. Others speculated that the log had been lost at sea or buried permanently. Then, on February 8th of 2019, a ranger conducting an early morning patrol found the log in a slightly different location, approximately 200 feet north of its usual position. The measurements were identical. The bore holes were unchanged. It had simply shifted within the same general area. The log remained on the beach for 3 weeks before disappearing in early March. No explanation has been provided. The Olympic National Park Service no longer responds to inquiries about the log. Vescio, now in his 80s, continues to monitor the beach during early February each year. Ruiz maintains a photographic archive documenting each known appearance. The next occurrence is expected in February of 2026. There are places where the night passes without you in it. Deer Park Campground sits at 5,400 feet on the northeastern shoulder of Blue Mountain in Olympic National Park. The site is accessible only by a narrow unpaved road that climbs steeply from Highway 101, winding through dense forest before emerging onto alpine meadows dotted with subalpine fir. The campground itself is primitive: 14 sites, no water, pit toilets, and exposure to weather that can turn severe without warning. Views extend across the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the north and the interior peaks of the Olympic Range to the south. The area has been used for high-altitude camping since the 1930s, when the Civilian Conservation Corps constructed the access road. Deer Park was never heavily developed, intentionally kept rustic to preserve the wilderness character. Visitors are warned about sudden fog, high winds, and the absence of services. The campground typically opens in late June, once snowmelt allows road access, and closes by October when winter storms return. There is no history of unusual incidents at Deer Park, no disappearances, no accidents beyond the typical sprains and weather-related emergencies common to backcountry sites. Rangers describe it as quiet, remote, and unremarkable, until campers began reporting nights they could not remember. The first documented case occurred in August of 2009. A couple from Portland, Oregon, Michael and Jennifer Lasko, arrived at Deer Park late in the afternoon on August 14th. They chose a site near the eastern edge of the campground, set up their tent, and began preparing dinner. Michael later stated that he remembered the sun setting around 8:30. They ate, cleaned up, and sat by a small campfire as darkness settled over the meadow. His last clear memory was adding wood to the fire sometime around 10. The next thing he remembered was waking up in the tent. It was full daylight. His watch read 6:45 in the morning. Jennifer was still asleep beside him. He felt rested but disoriented. He had no memory of banking the fire, climbing into the tent, or falling asleep. When he stepped outside, the campfire had burned down completely to cold ash. Their food had been put away properly, secured in a bear canister. The tent was fully zipped and staked. Everything suggested they had completed their evening routine methodically, but neither of them remembered doing any of it. Jennifer woke minutes later with the same confusion. Her last memory was sitting by the fire around 10. She had no recollection of the hours between then and dawn. They discussed it over breakfast, assuming they had simply been more exhausted than they realized and had gone through their routine on autopilot. It wasn't until they checked their phones that they noticed something else. Michael had set his phone to record time-lapse video of the stars overnight, propping it on a rock, facing south. When he reviewed the file, it was corrupted. The video showed approximately 40 minutes of normal footage, stars moving across the sky, the campfire visible in the foreground, then the image froze. The timestamp continued advancing, but the video remained locked on a single frame for hours. At 5:17 in the morning, the video resumed, showing the campsite in pre-dawn light. The interval between the freeze and the resumption was over 6 hours, but nothing had been recorded. Jennifer's fitness tracker, which monitored sleep patterns, showed a similar anomaly. It recorded her lying down at 10:12, then displayed a flat line, no movement, no heart rate data, until 5:43, when it registered her waking. The device had remained powered on, but it captured no physiological data for over 7 hours. The Lascos mentioned the experience to a ranger when they checked out the following day. The ranger, a seasonal employee named Colin Byers, noted it in the daily log but did not consider it significant. Equipment malfunctions were common in remote areas: cold temperatures, moisture, electronic interference from weather systems. But the reports continued. In September of 2010, a solo hiker named David Grenville camped at Deer Park and experienced the same phenomenon. He arrived in the late afternoon, set up his tent, and prepared a meal. His last memory was sitting outside watching the sunset. He woke at dawn with no recollection of the intervening hours. His camp stove had been turned off and packed away. His food was secured. His tent was zipped. He had no memory of doing any of it. Grenville had brought a digital camera set to take photographs at 30-minute intervals throughout the night. When he reviewed the images, he found that the camera had functioned normally until approximately 10:45, capturing images of the darkening campsite. Then the photographs stopped. The camera remained on. The battery was still charged, and the memory card had space, but no images were recorded between 10:45 and 5:30 in the morning. The camera resumed taking pictures at dawn, as if the intervening hours had not existed. In July of 2011, a family of 4, Richard and Paula Ostrander and their 2 teenage sons, camped at Deer Park for 3 nights. On the second night, all 4 family members experienced the same gap. They remembered eating dinner, talking around the fire, and watching stars emerge. None of them remembered going to bed. They woke simultaneously at dawn, confused and disoriented. The campfire had been extinguished properly. Their gear was organized. Everything had been done, but no one remembered doing it. Richard Ostrander was a physician with an interest in sleep disorders. He found the experience unsettling enough to file a detailed report with the Olympic National Park Medical Office. He noted that his family had not been unusually tired, had consumed no alcohol, and had no history of sleep disorders or memory issues. He described the experience as discontinuous, a clean break between evening wakefulness and morning wakefulness, with no subjective sense of time passing. By 2012, rangers at Olympic National Park had received enough similar reports to recognize a pattern. The incidents occurred exclusively at Deer Park Campground, almost always during clear weather and typically in late summer or early autumn. Campers would lose memory of the hours between approximately 10 in the evening and 5:30 in the morning. Electronic devices, cameras, phones, fitness trackers would malfunction during the same period, either failing to record data or producing corrupted files with irregular timestamps. A park investigator named Laura Kimball reviewed the reports in 2013. She identified 11 separate incidents involving 23 individuals. All described the same experience: normal evening activities, a sudden transition to waking at dawn, and no memory of the intervening night. In every case, the campsite showed evidence that the campers had completed their routines: fires extinguished, food stored, tents secured. But none of the individuals remembered performing these actions. Kimball consulted with a sleep researcher at the University of Washington, Dr. Ethan Vogel. He suggested several possibilities. Microsleeps, brief episodes of sleep lasting seconds to minutes, could occur without full awareness, but they would not account for hours of missing memory. Parasomnia, a category of sleep disorders involving complex behaviors during sleep, could explain automatic actions like securing a campsite, but it typically affected individuals, not entire groups, simultaneously. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated camp stoves could cause memory impairment, but the campers at Deer Park used outdoor stoves in open air, and none reported symptoms like headache or nausea. Vogel also noted that the electronic malfunctions were harder to explain. Fitness trackers and cameras failing simultaneously suggested environmental interference, electromagnetic fields, extreme temperature shifts, or atmospheric conditions. But weather data from Deer Park during the reported incidents showed normal conditions with no anomalies. In 2015, a group of amateur astronomers camped at Deer Park specifically to observe the Perseid meteor shower. The group included 6 people, all experienced in overnight outdoor observation. They set up telescopes, cameras, and recording equipment. They remembered watching meteors until approximately 11. The next memory any of them had was waking in their tents at dawn. All of their equipment had malfunctioned. Cameras set to long exposure photography had stopped recording mid-sequence. Audio recorders captured normal sounds until around 11, then produced static or silence for hours before resuming at dawn. One member of the group, a software engineer named Alicia Brennan, had worn a continuous glucose monitor for diabetes management. The device recorded normal readings until 10:53, then flatlined, not as if she had died, but as if the sensor had stopped detecting anything at all. At 5:38, readings resumed normally. Brennan later described the experience in an online astronomy forum. She emphasized that she felt physically normal upon waking, not groggy, not disoriented in the way one feels after oversleeping. She simply had no memory of the night. It was, she wrote, as if those hours had been excised. The National Park Service conducted a site evaluation in 2016. A team inspected the campground for environmental hazards, electromagnetic interference from nearby communication equipment, geological features that might produce unusual magnetic fields, or subsurface water sources that could emit gases. They found nothing. Deer Park was geologically stable, with no unusual mineral deposits, no fault lines, and no sources of electromagnetic radiation beyond standard atmospheric levels. A theory emerged that the phenomenon might be psychological, a form of collective suggestion or expectation, where campers who had heard stories about missing time unconsciously created the experience. But the theory failed to account for the earliest cases, which occurred before any stories were circulating, or for the consistent electronic malfunctions which could not be explained by psychological factors. Park officials began quietly discouraging overnight camping at Deer Park. They did not close the campground or issue warnings, but maintenance on the access road was reduced, and the site was omitted from some promotional materials. Rangers stopped mentioning it as a camping option unless visitors specifically asked. The most recent documented case occurred in August of 2022. A solo camper named Marcus Delorme arrived at Deer Park on the afternoon of August 19th. He was an experienced wilderness traveler and carried multiple recording devices, a GoPro camera, a smartphone, and a digital voice recorder. He set all three to document his evening. The last footage on any device showed him sitting by the fire at 10:37. The next footage on all three devices began at 5:41 in the morning. Timestamps on the files showed continuous recording, but the intervening hours contained only frozen images or corrupted data. Delorme reported the incident to park officials and provided copies of his recordings. A digital forensics specialist reviewed the files and confirmed that the devices had remained powered on throughout the night, but had captured no usable data during the missing hours. The specialist noted that the corruption patterns were inconsistent with typical file errors or hardware failures. The data appeared to have been recorded and then systematically degraded, though no known process would produce that result. Olympic National Park has not issued any official statement regarding the incidents at Deer Park. The campground remains open, and no warnings are posted. Rangers are instructed to log reports if campers mention unusual experiences, but are advised not to discuss the pattern publicly. Deer Park continues to attract visitors who arrive in the late afternoon, set up their tents, and prepare for the night. Some remember it. Others wake at dawn, rested and confused, with no memory of the darkness that passed, only the evidence that they moved through it. Fires tended, food stored, tents secured by hands they cannot remember using. Some places have a rhythm that cannot be measured. Ruby Beach sits on the southern edge of Olympic National Park, where the forested coastline meets the Pacific in a dramatic arrangement of sea stacks, driftwood, and smooth stones stained red by garnet sand. The beach is named for these garnets, which give the shore a distinctive russet hue at certain angles of light. 7 prominent sea stacks rise from the surf, eroded remnants of ancient headlands, their surfaces pocked with tidal pools and draped with kelp. The area has been part of the national park system since 1938 and attracts thousands of visitors annually, drawn by its stark beauty and accessible trails. The Quinault and Quileute people have inhabited this coastline for millennia. Their oral traditions describe the sea stacks as boundary markers, places where the ocean and land negotiate their constant exchange. Early European explorers noted the stacks in maritime charts, but found the coastline too dangerous for anchorage. The beach remained relatively isolated until Highway 101 was completed in the 1930s, opening the area to tourism. Ruby Beach is known for predictable things: powerful surf, sudden fog, extreme tidal ranges that expose and conceal the base of the stacks twice daily. What it is not known for, at least not officially, is sound. The first documented report came in October of 1996. A visitor from Seattle, a woman named Patricia Holbrook, was walking the beach during a new moon. It was late afternoon, overcast, with the tide beginning to recede. She approached one of the central sea stacks, a formation approximately 30 feet tall with a distinctive arch at its base. As she moved closer, she heard what she later described as a low, steady hum. Holbrook stopped to listen. The sound was rhythmic, pulsing slowly. She estimated one cycle every 4 to 5 seconds. It reminded her of breathing or the distant idle of a large engine. She walked around the stack, trying to locate the source. The sound was loudest near the base, within about 15 feet of the rock face. When she stepped farther away, it faded. When she approached again, it returned. She mentioned it to her husband, who had been photographing farther down the beach. He joined her at the stack, but heard nothing. Holbrook insisted the sound was there, steady, unmistakable. Her husband remained skeptical. They stayed for another 10 minutes. He heard nothing. She continued to hear the hum until the rising tide forced them to move back toward the parking area. Holbrook filed a brief note in the Olympic National Park visitor log, describing the experience as curious but not alarming. A park ranger reviewed the entry and assumed she had heard wind moving through cavities in the rock, a common acoustic effect on coastal formations. But the reports continued, always following the same pattern. In March of 1998, a geology student named Marcus Delacroix was conducting a coastal erosion study at Ruby Beach. He arrived on the evening of a new moon to photograph the sea stacks at low tide. As he set up his equipment near the same central stack Holbrook had described, he heard the hum. Delacroix had training in field acoustics and immediately tried to record it. He placed a directional microphone against the rock face and activated his recording equipment. The sound was clear to his ears, low, rhythmic, pulsing. But when he played back the recording, there was nothing. Waves, wind, gulls. No hum. He repositioned the microphone multiple times, testing different placements and angles. Each time he heard the sound clearly while recording. Each time, the playback was silent. Delacroix contacted a professor at the University of Washington, Dr. Evelyn Sorensen, who specialized in geological acoustics. Sorensen reviewed his recordings and found no evidence of the hum. She suggested that Delacroix might be experiencing a psychoacoustic phenomenon, a sound perceived by the brain but not actually present in the environment. Delacroix insisted the experience had been real and repeatable. He returned to Ruby Beach the following month during the next new moon. The sound was there again, in the same location, with the same rhythm. His equipment still captured nothing. In July of 2001, a family from Portland, Thomas and Rachel Nguyen, and their 12-year-old daughter, visited Ruby Beach on the day of a new moon. They arrived in the late afternoon and walked among the sea stacks as the tide receded. Their daughter Emily stopped near the central stack and asked her parents if they could hear the breathing. Both parents stopped to listen. Rachel heard it immediately, a low, rhythmic pulse. Thomas heard nothing. Emily described it as sounding like someone taking slow, deep breaths. Rachel agreed. The sound lasted approximately 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Rachel checked her watch. It was 6:14 in the evening, exactly the time of high tide according to the chart posted at the trailhead. The Nguyen's mentioned the experience to a ranger at the visitor center the next day. The ranger, a seasonal employee named Kyle Winters, had heard similar reports before. He told them it was likely wind interacting with the rock formations, a harmless and occasionally audible phenomenon. But privately, Winters noted the incident in his log, adding it to a growing list of nearly identical accounts. By 2005, Olympic National Park had received at least 18 separate reports of the hum at Ruby Beach. All described the same experience, a low, rhythmic sound near the base of the central sea stack, audible only within a close radius, occurring exclusively during new moon phases and ceasing at high tide. Witnesses consistently used the word breathing to describe the rhythm. Recording equipment consistently failed to capture it. A team from the University of Washington's Earth and Space Sciences Department visited Ruby Beach in November of 2006 to investigate. The team included Dr. Sorensen, an acoustic engineer named Dr. Howard Gallagher, and 2 graduate students. They arrived on the evening of a new moon equipped with sensitive microphones, seismographs, and spectrum analyzers. At approximately 5:30, as the tide receded, Dr. Sorensen and one of the graduate students, a woman named Iris Takahashi, both reported hearing the hum. Gallagher and the other graduate student heard nothing. The equipment detected no acoustic signals, no vibrations in the rock, no electromagnetic anomalies. Sorensen described the sound as a low-frequency pulse, regular and sustained, emanating from the sea stack. She estimated the frequency at around 40 hertz, at the lower threshold of human hearing, but the instruments, calibrated to detect frequencies well below that range, registered nothing. The team remained at the site for 3 hours. Sorensen and Takahashi continued to hear the sound intermittently, always near the same stack. At 8:07, exactly at high tide, both reported that the sound stopped. Gallagher reviewed all the data collected during that period. There were no anomalies, no signals, no evidence of any acoustic phenomenon. Gallagher proposed that the sound might be infrasound, frequencies below 20 hertz, which are inaudible to most people, but can sometimes be perceived as a physical sensation or vague sound. But infrasound would still register on their equipment, and it had not. He also noted that infrasound typically causes discomfort, nausea, anxiety, disorientation. The witnesses at Ruby Beach reported no such effects. They described the sound as neutral, even calming, simply unusual. Sorensen suggested an alternative explanation. The witnesses might be experiencing a form of auditory pareidolia, where the brain interprets random environmental noise as a structured pattern. The sound of waves, wind, and shifting stones could combine in a way that some individuals perceive as rhythmic. But this theory did not explain why the phenomenon occurred only during new moons, or why it consistently stopped at high tide. In 2009, a journalist named Rebecca Montoya visited Ruby Beach after reading about the reports online. She arrived on the day of a new moon, accompanied by a sound technician and a geologist. The technician brought professional-grade recording equipment. The geologist carried instruments to measure seismic activity and rock density. At approximately 6 in the evening, Montoya heard the hum. She described it as unmistakable, a slow, steady pulse, like the breathing of something enormous and patient. The sound technician, standing beside her, heard nothing. The geologist, positioned 10 feet away, also heard nothing. Montoya moved closer to the stack, then farther away, testing the boundaries. The sound was audible within roughly 15 feet of the rock face. Beyond that, it disappeared. The recording equipment captured ambient noise, surf, wind, the cries of gulls, but no hum. The geologist's instruments showed no unusual seismic activity. Montoya published an article about the experience in a regional magazine, describing it as one of the most disorienting moments of her career. She had heard something that could not be measured in a place where measurement should have been straightforward. The Olympic National Park Service has never issued an official statement about the phenomenon. Rangers acknowledge that some visitors report hearing unusual sounds at Ruby Beach, but the reports are treated as curiosities, not hazards. There have been no injuries, no incidents requiring intervention, no reason to restrict access or post warnings. A pattern analysis conducted in 2015 by an independent researcher named Dr. Lionel Kovacs examined the timing of the reports. He confirmed that all documented incidents occurred during new moon phases, and all ceased at the moment of high tide. Kovacs noted that new moons coincide with spring tides, the highest and lowest tides of the lunar cycle, when the gravitational pull of the moon and sun align. He speculated that the extreme tidal forces might create pressure changes within the rock, producing vibrations that some individuals could perceive. But his theory could not explain why scientific instruments failed to detect these vibrations, or why the sound was described so consistently as rhythmic and breath-like. The most recent documented case occurred in April of 2023. A photographer named Juliana Reyes was at Ruby Beach during a new moon, capturing long exposure images of the sea stacks at dusk. She heard the hum and recorded a voice memo on her phone describing what she was experiencing in real time. The memo captured her voice clearly, but no hum. She stayed until high tide, noting the exact moment the sound stopped, 8:31, matching the predicted high tide to the minute. Reyes shared her experience on social media, where it was met with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Several commenters claimed they had heard the same sound during visits to Ruby Beach. Others suggested explanations ranging from tinnitus to auditory hallucinations to deliberate hoaxes. No consensus has been reached. The hum at Ruby Beach remains undocumented by instruments, unexplained by science, and unreported by the majority of visitors. Those who hear it describe it in the same terms: low, rhythmic, like breathing. Those who do not hear it stand beside the witnesses and hear only the ordinary sounds of the coast. The sea stacks remain, worn slowly by tide and time, exhaling a rhythm that some can hear and none can prove. Not all paths lead where they claim to go. Mount Anderson rises to 7,321 feet in the eastern interior of Olympic National Park, a glaciated peak accessible only by backcountry trail. The Anderson Glacier Trail departs from the Dosa Wallops River drainage, climbing through old-growth forest before emerging into alpine meadows and finally reaching the glacier itself, a journey of approximately 9 miles one way. The trail was established in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps and has been maintained regularly by the National Park Service ever since. It is rated as difficult due to elevation gain and distance, but the route is well marked and appears on all official park maps. The area surrounding Mount Anderson is remote. The nearest road access is at the Dos Wallops campground, and from there, hikers must travel on foot through designated wilderness. Cell phone coverage is non-existent. The terrain is heavily forested at lower elevations, transitioning to subalpine meadows and exposed rock near the glacier. Weather can change rapidly. Fog rolls in without warning, and afternoon storms are common during summer months. Despite its isolation, the trail sees regular use. Experienced backpackers hike it for the views and the challenge. The National Park Service considers it well documented, adequately signed, and safe for those with proper preparation. There is no history of unusual disappearances. There's no pattern of accidents beyond the typical injuries associated with wilderness travel. But there is a pattern of something else. The first documented incident occurred in July of 2007. A solo hiker named Benjamin Kowalski set out from Dosa Wallops campground early in the morning, intending to reach the Anderson Glacier and return in 2 days. He was an experienced backpacker, familiar with Olympic National Park, and carried GPS, a map, and a compass. He filed a backcountry permit and provided a detailed itinerary. Kowalski did not return on schedule. Park rangers initiated a search on the 3rd day. They found him approximately 5 miles from the trailhead, disoriented and exhausted, sitting beside the trail at mile marker 4.7. He was uninjured but confused. When rangers asked what had happened, he struggled to explain. He said he had been hiking for what felt like 6 or 7 hours since passing mile marker 4. He remembered the trail clearly, ascending through forest, crossing a series of small streams, following switchbacks up a ridge. But when he checked his GPS, it showed he had moved less than half a mile. He thought the device was malfunctioning and continued hiking. Hours passed. He grew tired, stopped to rest, checked the GPS again. It still showed him near mile marker 4.7. He tried retracing his steps, thinking he had somehow looped back without realizing it. But the landmarks didn't match. Trees he remembered passing on his right now appeared on his left. A distinctive boulder he was certain he had walked past twice seemed to be in a different location each time. He lost confidence in his sense of direction and eventually stopped moving, waiting for help. Rangers examined his GPS unit. It was functioning normally. The track log showed erratic movement, loops, reversals, and long periods where he appeared to cover significant distance, but ended up almost exactly where he had started. The Rangers assumed he had become disoriented, possibly due to fatigue or dehydration, and had wandered off trail without realizing it. But Kowalski insisted he had never left the trail. He could see the markers. He had followed them carefully. The incident was logged as a routine confusion event, common enough in backcountry settings. Kowalski recovered fully and attributed the experience to exhaustion, though he never hiked the Anderson Glacier Trail again. In September of 2009, a group of 3 hikers, Laura Finch, David Brennan, and Sophia Ruiz, experienced something similar. They were attempting a 2-day round trip to the glacier. On the first day, they hiked to mile marker 4.7 without incident. Shortly after that point, Finch noticed something odd. She recognized a tree with a distinctively split trunk. She was certain they had passed it 20 minutes earlier. Brennan checked the map. According to their position, they should not have encountered that tree again. They continued for another hour. Landmarks began repeating. A fallen log across the trail appeared twice. A clearing with a particular arrangement of boulders seemed to recur. Ruiz suggested they had accidentally looped back, but the trail markers indicated forward progress. They decided to set up camp and reassess in the morning. The next day, they attempted to continue. Within 30 minutes, they encountered the same sense of disorientation. The trail felt wrong, not overgrown or damaged, but somehow inverted, as if they were moving through it in the wrong direction, even when walking uphill. They turned back and returned to the trailhead without reaching the glacier. All 3 filed reports with the Park Service, describing the experience as deeply unsettling but not dangerous. A ranger named Victor Delgado reviewed their reports. He noted similarities to Kowalski's account: disorientation near mile marker 4.7, a sense of spatial confusion, and difficulty making forward progress. Delgado hiked the trail himself the following week. He experienced nothing unusual and reached the glacier without incident. He concluded that the group had likely been disoriented by fog or fatigue, but the reports continued. In June of 2011, a couple from Tacoma, Gregory and Ann Holloway, became lost on the Anderson Glacier Trail. They had been hiking for what they estimated to be 5 hours when they realized they were still near mile marker 4.7. Gregory later described the experience to park rangers as impossible. He said they had walked steadily uphill, following the trail markers, never stopping for more than a few minutes. Yet their GPS showed minimal forward progress. Ann added that time itself felt distorted. They would walk for what seemed like an hour, check their watches, and find that only 15 or 20 minutes had passed. Or the opposite would occur. They would hike for what felt like a brief interval, check the time, and discover that over an hour had elapsed. The Holloways turned back and returned to the trailhead. They reported the incident to park officials, emphasizing that the trail markers had been visible and clear throughout. They had not been lost in the traditional sense. They knew where the trail was. They simply could not move forward along it. Olympic National Park conducted a trail maintenance review in 2012. A crew hiked the Anderson Glacier Trail, inspecting markers, clearing brush, and documenting conditions. They found the trail to be in excellent condition. Markers were properly placed, the route was clear, and there were no obstructions or confusing junctions. The crew reported no difficulties navigating the trail. Yet between 2012 and 2018, park records documented 11 separate incidents of hikers becoming disoriented near mile marker 4.7. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Hikers would pass the marker and, within a short distance, begin experiencing spatial confusion. Landmarks would repeat, time would feel inconsistent, forward progress would become difficult or impossible. In most cases, hikers turned back. In a few cases, they continued and eventually reached the glacier, though they invariably described the experience as disorienting and unpleasant. A geographer from Western Washington University, Dr. Melanie Strand, reviewed the reports in 2019. She noted that mile marker 4.7 corresponded to a specific topographic feature, a narrow ridgeline where the trail switchbacks through dense forest. The area was heavily canopied, with limited sight lines and few distant landmarks. Strand suggested that the combination of repetitive terrain and reduced visibility could create a form of trail blindness, where hikers lose their sense of progress and begin to perceive loops or reversals that are not actually occurring. But trail blindness typically affected individuals, not groups, and it did not explain the GPS anomalies. Multiple hikers had recorded track logs showing erratic movement patterns, loops, and inexplicable position jumps while remaining on the trail. Dr. Strand conducted a field study in August of 2019, hiking the trail with a research assistant and carrying multiple GPS units, compasses, and mapping tools. They reached mile marker 4.7 and continued without incident. Their GPS tracks showed normal, linear forward progress. Strand concluded that the disorientation reports were likely due to psychological factors, fatigue, anxiety, or expectation bias, rather than any physical anomaly with the trail. However, a follow-up study in 2020 produced different results. A team of 3 hikers, including a professional land surveyor named Thomas Milliken, hiked the trail with the specific goal of documenting the phenomenon. At mile marker 4.7, Milliken began taking precise measurements using a surveying-grade GPS and a laser rangefinder. Within 20 minutes, he noticed discrepancies. The GPS showed forward movement, but the rangefinder readings to fixed landmarks, distant peaks visible through gaps in the canopy, did not change proportionally. He was moving according to the GPS, but the landscape was not receding at the expected rate. Milliken's team continued for another hour. The GPS indicated they had covered over a mile. But when Milliken used the rangefinder to measure distance to a specific peak they had been using as a reference point, the reading was nearly identical to what it had been an hour earlier. They appeared to be moving, but they were not covering ground. The team returned to the trailhead and submitted a detailed report to Olympic National Park. Milliken included his survey data, GPS logs, and rangefinder measurements. The data showed a clear inconsistency, recorded movement that did not correspond to actual displacement. Park officials reviewed the report but took no action. A spokesperson stated that GPS devices could malfunction in dense forest due to limited satellite visibility, and that rangefinder measurements were subject to user error. The trail remained open and unmarked for any unusual conditions. In 2022, a park ranger named Elena Vasquez was assigned to hike the Anderson Glacier Trail as part of a routine wilderness assessment. She reached mile marker 4.7 in the early afternoon. Vasquez later reported that she experienced a distinct sense of disorientation, not confusion about the trail's location, but a feeling that the space around her had become unstable. She described it as similar to walking on a chuan in mild seas, where the ground seemed to shift subtly underfoot, even though it remained visibly solid. Vasquez continued hiking and reached the glacier without further incident. But she noted in her report that the sensation persisted for approximately 2 miles beyond mile marker 4.7 before gradually fading. She recommended that the area be monitored for potential trail hazards, though she could not identify any specific danger. No official explanation has been provided. The Anderson Glacier Trail remains open and is listed on all park maps as a standard backcountry route. Rangers acknowledge that some hikers report disorientation near mile marker 4.7, but the incidents are attributed to the challenging nature of wilderness navigation and the psychological effects of isolation and fatigue. The trail markers remain in place, clear and properly spaced. The path is visible, well-maintained, and no more difficult than dozens of other trails in Olympic National Park. Yet the pattern persists. Hikers pass mile marker 4.7 and find that the trail ahead no longer behaves as it should, that distance becomes unreliable, and that time stretches or compresses in ways that measurement cannot capture. The trail continues, winding upward through the forest toward the glacier, marked and maintained and mapped. But somewhere near mile 4.7, it also does something else, something that GPS cannot track and surveying cannot explain. It folds back on itself, or loops, or holds those who walk it in a space where forward motion and actual progress become two different things entirely. Some records are kept not to be remembered, but to be forgotten in an organized way. Fort Worden occupies 434 acres on a bluff overlooking the Strait of Juan de Fuca at the northeastern tip of the Olympic Peninsula. Constructed between 1897 and 1920, it was part of a coastal defense network designed to protect Puget Sound and the naval shipyards at Bremerton. The fort featured massive concrete batteries housing disappearing guns, underground corridors, observation posts, and barracks for over 1,000 troops. It remained an active military installation through World War II, then was decommissioned in 1953. The property was transferred to Washington State Parks in 1957 and converted into a conference center and historical site. Many of the original structures remain: gun batteries, officers' quarters, a balloon hangar, and a network of tunnels connecting the various installations. The fort attracts visitors interested in military history and serves as a venue for educational programs and events. Most of the buildings have been renovated or repurposed, their original functions preserved through exhibits and guided tours. Fort Worden's military records are extensive and well documented. Personnel rosters, training logs, and operational reports are housed in the National Archives. The fort's role in coastal defense is thoroughly chronicled, with no gaps in the historical record, or so it was assumed until 2011. In March of that year, the State Parks Department contracted with a construction firm to renovate Building 400, a former administrative structure near the main parade ground. The building had served various functions over the decades: offices, storage, living quarters for civilian staff. It was scheduled to be converted into additional conference space. Contractors began interior demolition on March 7th. A crew supervisor named Vincent Holloway was overseeing the removal of interior walls in the basement when workers discovered an anomaly. Behind a section of drywall installed sometime in the 1960s, they found a steel door. The door was not marked on any blueprint or renovation plan. It was sealed, not locked, but welded shut along the frame, as if someone had intended to make it permanently inaccessible. Holloway contacted the project manager, a woman named Laura Kimball. She reviewed the building's architectural drawings and found no indication that the door should exist. The space beyond it was not represented on any floor plan. Kimball contacted the Washington State Parks Historical Preservation Office, which advised that the door be opened and the space documented before any further work proceeded. On March 14th, contractors cut through the welds and opened the door. Behind it was a small room, approximately 15 feet by 20 feet, with no windows and a single ventilation grate near the ceiling. The room was dry, climate-controlled by residual insulation, and filled with filing cabinets. There were 7 cabinets in total, standard military-issue steel units from the 1940s. They were labeled with alphanumeric codes, W1 through W7. Each cabinet contained files organized by date, spanning from January 1943 through August 1945. The documents were typewritten on military letterhead, stamped with security classifications that had long since expired, and signed by officers whose names appeared in no other Fort Worden records. The files were weather logs, or something that resembled weather logs. Kimball photographed the room and its contents before allowing anything to be removed. She contacted the Washington State Historical Society, which sent an archivist named Helena Ruiz to assess the find. Ruiz spent 2 days examining the documents. Her initial report, filed on March 21st, described the materials as highly unusual and potentially significant. The logs recorded atmospheric observations taken at Fort Worden during World War II. Each entry included date, time, barometric pressure, temperature, wind speed and direction, cloud cover, and visibility. Standard meteorological data. But interspersed with these routine observations were notations that made no sense. Certain entries were marked with codes like Event A7 or Occurrence D12. These entries included barometric pressure readings that were physically impossible, values far outside the range that Earth's atmosphere could produce. Some recorded pressures below 25 inches of mercury, lower than the center of the most powerful hurricanes. Others showed pressures above 32 inches, higher than any naturally occurring atmospheric condition. Temperature readings were similarly anomalous. Some entries recorded localized temperature drops of 40 degrees Fahrenheit over intervals of less than 10 minutes, with no corresponding weather system to explain the change. Wind speeds were listed as calm in one entry, then exceeding 100 miles per hour 15 minutes later, then calm again, all without storms or frontal passages noted. The most disturbing entries included a repeated phrase, visual confirmation of drift. The phrase appeared in over 200 separate log entries, always associated with the coded events. It was never explained. The logs did not define what drift meant, did not describe what was being visually confirmed, and did not indicate who was making the observations. The phrase was simply noted, time-stamped, and signed by an observing officer. Dr. Ruiz cross-referenced the names on the documents with military personnel records. 3 officers' names appeared repeatedly as signatories: Lieutenant Raymond Hollister, Captain Evelyn Marsh, and Major Tobias Greenfield. None of these individuals appeared in Fort Worden's official personnel rosters. The National Archives had no record of their service at the installation. Military service records listed Hollister and Marsh as having been stationed elsewhere during the relevant period. Hollister at Fort Lewis, Marsh at the Presidio in San Francisco. Greenfield's name did not appear in any military database. Ruiz contacted the National Weather Service and provided copies of several log entries. A meteorologist named Dr. Marcus Delacroix reviewed the data and confirmed that the barometric pressure readings were impossible under known atmospheric conditions. He suggested that the instruments might have been faulty or that the readings had been fabricated, though he could not explain why anyone would fabricate meteorological data in a sealed basement archive. In May of 2011, the Washington State Historical Society took custody of the files. They were transported to the Society's archive facility in Tacoma for preservation and analysis. A team of historians, archivists, and military researchers was assembled to examine the documents and determine their origin and purpose. The team's findings, summarized in a report completed in November of 2011, raised more questions than answers. The paper used in the logs was consistent with U.S. military stock from the 1940s. The typewriters used were standard-issue military models from that era. The signatures appeared authentic, not forged. But the content of the logs did not correspond to any known meteorological, scientific, or military program. One researcher, Dr. Lionel Kovacs, suggested that the logs might be related to a classified research program conducted during World War II. The U.S. military had experimented with weather modification, radar systems, and atmospheric research during the war. Perhaps Fort Worden had been a site for such experiments, and the logs documented those activities. But weather modification research in the 1940s was rudimentary. Cloud seeding trials, attempts to disperse fog, nothing that would produce the extreme readings recorded in the logs. And classified programs typically left some trace in declassified records, even if details remained redacted. The Fort Worden logs had no corresponding references in any declassified military archive. Another possibility was that the logs were part of a training exercise, fabricated data used to teach meteorological analysis or code breaking to military personnel. But training materials were not typically sealed in hidden rooms and forgotten for over 60 years. And the logs showed no indication of being instructional, no annotations, no corrections, no evidence of students working through problems. The most unsettling detail was the consistency of the drift references. Over 200 entries, spanning 2.5 years, all noting visual confirmation of drift, in the same matter-of-fact tone used to record wind direction or cloud cover. Whatever drift was, the observers had seen it repeatedly, documented it methodically, and treated it as a routine phenomenon. Dr. Ruiz attempted to locate descendants or associates of the officers named in the logs. She found a niece of Lieutenant Raymond Hollister living in Spokane. The woman, now in her 70s, said her uncle had served in the Army during World War II but had never spoken about his duties. He had died in 1981. She had no knowledge of Fort Worden or any unusual assignments. Captain Evelyn Marsh's records indicated she had been discharged in 1946 and had worked as a schoolteacher in California until her death in 1993. A colleague who had known her described Marsh as reserved and professional, but noted that she never discussed her military service and became visibly uncomfortable when the topic arose. Major Tobias Greenfield remained a cipher. No birth records, no service records, no death certificate. The name appeared only in the Fort Worden logs, signed neatly at the bottom of dozens of entries, always with the same rank and title, Major T. Greenfield, Observing Officer. In 2013, a journalist named Rebecca Montoya requested access to the logs for an article on unexplained military records. The Washington State Historical Society granted her access to view the documents, but did not allow her to photograph or reproduce them. Montoya spent 3 days reviewing the files and later published a brief article in a regional history magazine. She described the logs as deeply strange and frustratingly incomplete, noting that the Society had no plans to digitize or display them publicly. Montoya's article attracted limited attention. A few historians and military enthusiasts expressed interest, but most dismissed the logs as either fabricated, misunderstood, or related to some obscure and now irrelevant training program. The Washington State Historical Society issued no further statements about the documents. In 2017, Dr. Ruiz retired from the Historical Society. In an exit interview, she mentioned the Fort Worden logs as one of the most puzzling discoveries of her career. She noted that the Society had chosen not to pursue further research into the documents, citing limited resources and the absence of any clear historical context. The logs remained in storage, cataloged, but unexamined. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2019 seeking any military records related to atmospheric research at Fort Worden returned no results. The Department of Defense stated that it had no records matching the description and no information about officers named Hollister, Marsh, or Greenfield serving at Fort Worden during the specified period. The sealed room in Building 400 was documented, photographed, and then integrated into the renovation. The door was removed, the space was opened into the larger basement, and the room's original purpose was erased. No plaque marks its location. No exhibit explains what was found there. The logs remain in the Washington State Historical Society archives in Tacoma, stored in climate-controlled conditions, accessible by appointment but rarely requested. The barometric readings that defy physics, the officers who may not have existed, and the repeated references to drift, visual confirmation of something observed over 200 times, never explained, never defined, are preserved in typed entries on yellowing paper, signed and dated, methodically recorded by people whose names exist nowhere else. And whatever they were watching, whatever they saw drifting over the Strait of Juan de Fuca during those years, remains unnamed in every record except the one that was sealed behind a welded door and left to be forgotten. Sound does not travel backward except in one place where it seems to. Mount Olympus rises to 7,980 feet in the heart of Olympic National Park, a glaciated massif visible from Seattle on clear days. The mountain dominates the interior of the Olympic Peninsula, its summit perpetually snow-capped, its slopes carved by the Blue Glacier and several smaller ice fields. Indigenous peoples of the region, the Quinault, Quileute, and other coastal tribes regarded the peak as sacred, a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected. European explorers named it after the Greek mountain of the gods, though they never climbed it. The first recorded ascent occurred in 1907, and the mountain has since become a challenging but accessible objective for experienced mountaineers. The standard climbing route follows the Hoh River Trail through temperate rainforest, then ascends via glacier meadows to the Blue Glacier. From there, climbers traverse the glacier and ascend the final rocky summit pyramid. The route is technically moderate, but requires glacier travel skills, and weather can deteriorate rapidly. The National Park Service maintains a climbing register at the ranger station, and most parties complete the ascent in 2 to 3 days. Mount Olympus has no unusual history of accidents or disappearances beyond the normal risks associated with alpine climbing. Avalanches, crevasse falls, and exposure have claimed lives over the decades, but the mountain is not considered particularly dangerous by Pacific Northwest standards. What makes it unusual is not what happens to people there, but what happens to sound. The first documented report came in August of 1998. A climbing party of 4, Michael Tomlinson, Patricia Vega, Sean Brennan, and Jennifer Aldrich, was ascending the standard route toward the summit. They had camped on the Blue Glacier and were climbing the upper slopes, navigating through rock bands and snow gullies. At approximately 6,800 feet, Tomlinson called out to Vega, who was 20 feet ahead, asking her to wait while he adjusted his pack. He heard his own voice echo back before he finished speaking. Tomlinson stopped mid-sentence, confused. Mountain echoes are common, but they occur after the sound is produced, reflecting off rock faces or ice. This echo had overlapped with his voice, arriving while he was still talking. He called out again, deliberately. The same thing happened. His voice came back to him, slightly delayed, but arriving before he finished the sentence, creating a disorienting overlap. Vega, standing higher on the slope, heard it too. She later described it as unsettling, like listening to someone speak in a poorly synchronized recording. Brennan and Aldrich, positioned lower on the route, both reported hearing the same effect when they shouted to one another. The phenomenon persisted for approximately 20 minutes as the group climbed through that elevation band, then ceased abruptly once they ascended above 7,000 feet. Tomlinson mentioned the experience in the climbing register when the group descended. A park ranger reviewed the entry but did not consider it significant. Acoustic anomalies in mountain environments are not uncommon, caused by wind, temperature inversions, or the geometry of rock formations reflecting sound in unexpected ways. But the reports continued, always describing the same phenomenon at the same elevation. In June of 2001, a solo climber named David Kowalski experienced the echo while ascending through the same area. He tested it repeatedly, shouting single words and listening carefully. Each time, he heard the echo begin before he finished speaking. He estimated the overlap at roughly half a second. The return sound started while he was still vocalizing, creating a disorienting doubling effect. Kowalski was an audio engineer by profession and understood acoustic principles well enough to know that what he was hearing should not be possible. Echoes are reflections. They occur after the original sound. They do not precede their source. In September of 2003, a guided climbing group encountered the phenomenon. The guide, a man named Raymond Hollister, with over 15 years of experience on Mount Olympus, had never heard of the echo before. When his clients began commenting on the strange acoustic effect, he tested it himself. He clapped his hands. The clap echoed back, overlapping with the original sound. He shouted. His voice returned before the shout was complete. Hollister later told park officials that the experience was profoundly wrong, not frightening, but deeply disorienting, as if the mountain were responding to sounds that had not yet finished being made. By 2005, Olympic National Park had received at least 8 separate reports of the phenomenon. All occurred at approximately the same elevation, between 6,700 and 6,900 feet on the upper slopes of Mount Olympus. Climbers described the same experience. Vocalizations produced echoes that overlapped with the original sound, arriving too quickly to be conventional reflections. The effect was consistent across different weather conditions, times of day, and seasons. It occurred in clear weather and in fog, during calm conditions and high winds, in summer and winter. A park resource manager named Laura Strand contacted the University of Washington's Department of Earth and Space Sciences. She provided copies of the climbing reports and asked if the phenomenon could be investigated. Dr. Evelyn Ruiz, an acoustic physicist, agreed to lead a study. In July of 2006, Dr. Ruiz and a team of 3 graduate students hiked to the Blue Glacier and established a base camp. They carried sensitive audio recording equipment, including directional microphones, spectrum analyzers, and digital recorders, capable of capturing sound with millisecond precision. The goal was to document the echo, analyze its characteristics, and determine whether it was a genuine acoustic anomaly or a perceptual artifact caused by altitude, fatigue, or environmental conditions. The team climbed to the 6,800-foot elevation on July 18th. Conditions were clear with light winds and good visibility. Dr. Ruiz positioned her equipment and began testing. She had one graduate student, a man named Thomas Milliken, stand 50 feet away and shout predetermined phrases. She recorded the sounds and monitored the waveforms in real time. Milliken reported hearing the overlapping echo immediately. Ruiz, listening through headphones, also heard it, but when she reviewed the recordings, there was nothing. The waveforms showed Milliken's voice, a brief pause, and then a conventional echo, arriving several hundred milliseconds later, exactly as expected from sound reflecting off the nearby rock face. There was no premature echo, no overlap, no anomaly. Ruiz was baffled. She tested the equipment extensively. It was functioning normally. She recorded dozens of additional vocalizations. Each time she and her team heard the overlapping echo in real time, but the recordings captured only normal acoustic reflections. One of the graduate students, a woman named Iris Delgado, suggested that the phenomenon might occur at a frequency or wavelength that the equipment could not capture, but the microphones were calibrated to record across the full range of human hearing and beyond. If the sound existed, the equipment should have detected it. The team remained on the mountain for 3 more days, conducting tests at different elevations and locations. The echo occurred consistently between 6,700 and 6,900 feet. Above or below that range, it disappeared. But despite dozens of recordings, none captured the anomaly. The equipment registered only normal echoes, arriving after the original sounds, behaving exactly as acoustic physics predicted. Dr. Ruiz published a preliminary report in 2007. She confirmed that multiple witnesses had consistently described hearing overlapping echoes at a specific elevation on Mount Olympus, but stated that scientific equipment had failed to document the phenomenon. She proposed several possibilities. The effect might be a psychoacoustic illusion caused by altitude or atmospheric pressure, a form of auditory pareidolia where the brain misinterprets normal echoes as overlapping, or a real acoustic phenomenon occurring at frequencies or through mechanisms that current instrumentation could not detect. In 2009, a second study was conducted by a team from Western Washington University. They used different equipment, higher resolution recorders, multiple microphone arrays, real-time analysis software. The results were identical. Climbers and researchers heard the overlapping echo. The equipment recorded nothing unusual. A third study, in 2014, employed even more sophisticated technology, including laser-based acoustic measurement tools and seismic sensors to detect subsurface vibrations that might influence sound propagation. Again, human observers reported the phenomenon. Again, the instruments captured only conventional echoes. One researcher, Dr. Marcus Strand, noted in his report that the failure of equipment was itself unusual. If the phenomenon were purely perceptual, a trick of the brain, it would be consistent across individuals but should not affect multiple independent observers in identical ways. Yet every person who climbed through that elevation band reported hearing the same thing, echoes that arrived before the original sounds completed, and every instrument failed to record it. Strand suggested that the equipment failures might be significant. 3 separate studies using different technologies had all experienced the same problem. Equipment that functioned normally at other elevations became unable to capture the anomaly at 6,800 feet. It was as if the phenomenon actively resisted documentation. Olympic National Park has issued no warnings or advisories related to the echo. The climbing route remains open and unmarked for any acoustic anomalies. Rangers acknowledge that some climbers report unusual sounds, but attribute the reports to the challenging environment and the psychological effects of high altitude. In 2019, a climber named Alicia Brennan recorded a voice memo on her phone while ascending through the affected area. She described the echo as she experienced it, speaking continuously for over a minute. When she played the recording back at base camp, her voice sounded normal. There was no overlapping echo, no premature reflection, just her voice, followed by a conventional echo, arriving exactly when it should. But while making the recording, she had heard her words return to her before they left her mouth. She was certain of it. Every other climber in her party confirmed the same experience. The most recent documented case occurred in August of 2023. A solo climber named Julian Ortega deliberately brought professional audio equipment to test the phenomenon. He positioned multiple recorders at different distances, used calibrated sound sources, and conducted systematic tests over several hours. He heard the overlapping echo throughout. When he reviewed the recordings, they showed only normal acoustic behavior. Ortega later wrote in an online climbing forum that the experience had been more unsettling than any objective danger he had faced in the mountains. He described it as a fundamental violation of how reality should work. Hearing sound behave in a way that should not be possible, while every instrument insisted that nothing unusual was occurring. No explanation has been provided. The echo continues to be reported by climbers ascending Mount Olympus, always at the same elevation, always described in the same way. And it continues to evade every attempt to measure, record, or prove its existence beyond the consistent testimony of those who hear it. Somewhere near 7,000 feet, on the upper slopes of a mountain sacred to the people who first knew it, sound behaves differently. It returns before it should, arriving ahead of itself, creating an overlap that instrumentation cannot detect and that acoustic physics cannot explain. And climbers continue to ascend through that zone, calling out to one another, hearing their voices come back too soon, and descending with the unsettling knowledge that for a brief time they occupied a space where cause and effect became negotiable. Some boundaries are drawn by forces that leave no signature. Sequim occupies a rain shadow on the northeastern Olympic Peninsula, receiving only 16 inches of annual precipitation, a stark contrast to the temperate rainforests less than 20 miles south. The town sits between the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the north and the Olympic Mountains to the south, on land that was home to the Sklallam people for thousands of years before European settlement began in the 1860s. The area became known for agriculture, irrigated fields producing hay, vegetables, and later lavender, and for its unusual dryness, a microclimate anomaly in one of the wettest regions of North America. Early settlers noted the region's suitability for farming. The soil was rich, well-drained glacial, till deposited during the last ice age. By the late 19th century, homesteaders had established farms across the Sequim Prairie, and the town incorporated in 1913. Property boundaries were surveyed, roads were laid out, and the landscape was divided into the orderly grid common to American settlement. But one line on that grid has never been settled. The first documented reference appears in Sklallam County land records from 1889. A surveyor named William Thatcher was mapping township boundaries for the General Land Office when he noted an unusual feature running roughly east-west across the survey area. He described it as a strip of barren ground, 30 feet in width, of unknown origin and extent. Thatcher's field notes indicated that the strip was visible from elevated vantage points, appearing as a pale band cutting through otherwise uniform prairie. Thatcher assumed it was a natural feature, perhaps an old stream bed, a geological fault, or a strip of soil with different mineral content. He marked it on his plat maps and continued his work. Subsequent surveys confirmed the feature's existence and its remarkable straightness. It ran for miles, deviating no more than a few feet from a perfectly linear course. By the early 20th century, farmers attempting to cultivate the land discovered something stranger. Crops would not grow on the strip. Wheat, oats, potatoes, nothing planted there survived. Seeds would germinate, produce weak seedlings, then wither within days. Farmers tried amending the soil, irrigating heavily, rotating crops. Nothing worked. Eventually they stopped planting the strip and simply plowed around it. In 1923, a Sequim resident named Margaret Holloway attempted to build a chicken coop across the strip on her property. She poured a concrete foundation, erected the frame, and installed the chickens. Within a week, the birds refused to enter the structure. They clustered against the fence line, as far from the strip as possible. Holloway moved the coop 15 feet to the north. The chickens occupied it without issue. Similar accounts accumulated over the decades. Dogs would not walk, not across the strip. Horses balked when led over it. Deer trails visible in the surrounding fields curved around it, maintaining a consistent distance as if following an invisible fence. The strip itself remained bare. No grass, no weeds, no volunteer plants of any kind. It was not dead soil in the conventional sense. It simply would not support life. In 1967, a soil scientist from Washington State University named Dr. Raymond Kowalski conducted tests on the strip at the request of Clallam County officials. He collected samples at multiple points along its length and compared them to adjacent soil. The results showed no significant differences. pH levels were identical. Nutrient content was comparable. There was no contamination, no heavy metals, no pesticides, no industrial pollutants. The soil on the strip was, by all measurable standards, as fertile as the surrounding farmland. Kowalski planted test seeds in greenhouse conditions using soil from the strip. They germinated normally and grew without issue. He returned the same soil to its original location and planted seeds there. They failed. He repeated the experiment multiple times with identical results. The soil itself was not the problem. Something about the location, the specific place where the strip existed, prevented growth. Kowalski's report, filed with the county in 1968, concluded that the phenomenon was not explicable through standard soil science, and recommended further investigation by geologists or environmental scientists. No such investigation was conducted. The strip was noted in property records and left alone. In 1979, a geologist named Dr. Evelyn Strand surveyed the strip using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry. She was searching for subsurface features, buried pipes, geological formations, fault lines that might explain the surface anomaly. The scans revealed nothing unusual, no underground structures, no mineral deposits, no voids or discontinuities. The subsurface beneath the strip was identical to the surrounding area. Strand did note one curious finding. The strip's alignment corresponded to no known geographic or geological feature. It did not follow a watershed, a fault line, or a contact between different rock types. It was not parallel to magnetic north or true north. It ran at approximately 73 degrees from true north, an orientation with no apparent relationship to the region's topography or geology. Local residents had their own explanations. Some suggested the strip marked an old Native American trail worn so deeply into the earth that nothing would grow there. But the Clallam Nation had no oral tradition referencing such a trail, and the strip's width and straightness were inconsistent with footpaths, which tend to meander and narrow over time. Others proposed that the strip was a remnant of early logging activity, a skid road where logs had been dragged, compacting the soil beyond. Recovery. But logging in the Sequim area had been limited, and skid roads typically showed evidence of use, rutting, compaction, remnants of corduroy surfaces. The strip showed none of these. The soil was loose, not compacted, and there were no traces of logging infrastructure. In 1994, a journalist named Thomas Milliken walked the entire length of the strip, documenting it with photographs and GPS coordinates. He started at the western edge, where the strip began abruptly in a field near Sequim Bay, and followed it eastward for 11.3 miles, where it ended just as abruptly near the Dungeness River. Along the way, he noted that the strip's boundaries were sharp. Vegetation grew right up to the edge, then stopped. There was no gradual transition, no zone of stunted growth. It was as if an invisible barrier separated the living land from the sterile strip. Milliken interviewed property owners whose land the strip crossed. Most were resigned to its presence. They farmed around it, mowed it to keep it tidy, and avoided building anything on it. One farmer, a man named Victor Delgado, said his grandfather had tried dynamiting a section of the strip in the 1930s, thinking there might be bedrock close to the surface preventing root growth. The explosion revealed only normal soil. Within a year, the disturbed section had returned to its barren state. In 2003, a team from the University of Washington's Department of Earth and Space Sciences conducted a comprehensive study. They used modern analytical techniques, spectrometry, isotope analysis, electromagnetic surveys, to search for any anomaly that might explain the strip. They found none. The land was ordinary in every measurable way except one. Nothing lived on it. The team's report, published in 2004, acknowledged the phenomenon but offered no explanation. The authors noted that the strip's existence was well documented. Its effects were consistent and repeatable, and its cause was unknown. They speculated that some historical event, a fire, a chemical spill, a biological agent, might have sterilized the land, but they could find no evidence of such an event and no mechanism by which sterility could persist for over a century in soil that tested as healthy and fertile. One researcher, Dr. Helena Ruiz, proposed a more unsettling possibility. She noted that the strip's straightness and length suggested intentionality. It had the character of something constructed or marked, not something naturally occurring. But if it was constructed, it predated all European settlement and left no archaeological trace. And if it was marked, the marker was invisible to every instrument used to detect it. Clallam County property records acknowledge the strip in survey descriptions. Parcels are noted as crossing the settlement line or bounded by the anomaly. Real estate disclosures mention it when relevant, but no official explanation is provided. The county planning department classifies it as a pre-existing geographic feature and advises against building on it, not because of any known hazard, but because structures placed there tend to be avoided or abandoned. In 2012, a developer attempted to build a small housing subdivision that would have crossed the strip. The plan called for paving over it and constructing homes on both sides. The county approved the development, but construction crews reported difficulties. Equipment malfunctioned when positioned over the strip. Workers described a vague sense of discomfort, not fear, but an instinctive reluctance to spend time there. The developer eventually revised the plan, routing roads around the strip and leaving it as a narrow greenway through the subdivision. The strip remains visible on satellite imagery, a thin, pale line cutting across fields, forests, and developed areas. It is maintained by property owners as open space, mowed or left fallow, never cultivated. No one has successfully grown anything on it in over 130 years of documented attempts. In 2018, a botanist named Dr. Marcus Strand conducted a final experiment. He transplanted mature trees, saplings with established root systems, onto the strip, providing them with water, nutrients, and care. The trees survived for 3 weeks, then began to decline. Leaves yellowed, branches died back, and within 2 months all the transplants were dead. Autopsies showed no disease, no pest damage, no nutrient deficiency. The trees had simply stopped living. Strand removed the dead trees and tested the soil again. It was unchanged, fertile, healthy, and by all measures capable of supporting life. He planted seeds in the same spots. They did not germinate. No further studies are planned. The strip is now accepted as a permanent feature of the Sequim landscape, acknowledged in surveys, avoided in development, unexplained by science. It runs for 11 miles, 30 feet wide, perfectly straight, through land that should sustain life but does not. And every spring, when the fields around it green with new growth, the strip remains bare, a pale scar across the prairie marking a boundary that was drawn by no hand anyone can identify and enforced by no mechanism anyone can measure. Some paths are shared with travelers who leave no trace of passing. The Spruce Railroad Trail follows the northern shore of Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park, a 4-mile route carved into the hillside above deep glacially formed water. The trail occupies the bed of a railroad constructed during World War I to transport Sitka spruce for aircraft production. The timber was never harvested in significant quantities. The war ended before the operation became fully functional, and the railroad was abandoned by 1921. The tracks were removed, and nature reclaimed most of the corridor until the National Park Service converted it to a hiking and cycling trail in the 1980s. Lake Crescent is known for its clarity and depth, reaching over 600 feet in places. The Klallam people have inhabited the area for thousands of years and regard the lake with a particular reverence. Their oral traditions describe it as a boundary place, where the physical world overlaps with something older and less easily defined. European settlers arrived in the late 19th century, drawn by timber and later by the lake's stark beauty. The area became part of Olympic National Park in 1938. The Spruce Railroad Trail is considered an easy, scenic route suitable for families. It passes through 2 tunnels blasted through rock, crosses a bridge over a deep inlet, and offers views across the lake to the surrounding mountains. The trail sees regular use year-round, maintained by the Park Service, and regarded as one of the more accessible paths in the Olympic backcountry. It is also a trail where people see other hikers who should not exist. The first documented report came in August of 2007. A cyclist named Patricia Holbrook was riding the trail westbound in the late afternoon. The day was clear, visibility excellent, and she was alone on the trail. Approximately 1 mile from the eastern trailhead, she saw a figure ahead, a person walking slowly in the same direction she was traveling. The figure wore gray or light-colored clothing and moved with a steady, unhurried gait. Holbrook called out a greeting as she approached. The figure did not respond or turn. She slowed her bike, preparing to pass, and called out again, "On your left," to alert the person. No response. She passed within a few feet. The figure continued walking, facing forward, and Holbrook continued riding. When she glanced back a few seconds later, the trail behind her was empty. Holbrook assumed the person had stepped off the trail into the woods, though she had heard no sound of movement through the underbrush. She thought little of it until she mentioned the encounter to a park ranger at the visitor center the next day. The ranger, a seasonal employee named Michael Tomlinson, asked her to describe what she had seen. When she did, he told her that others had reported similar encounters. In September of 2008, a couple hiking the trail, David and Ann Brennan, saw the same figure. They were walking eastbound in the morning, and the figure appeared ahead of them, moving in the same direction. The Brennans described it as a person in gray clothing, walking at a slow, steady pace. They called out. The figure did not respond. They quickened their pace to catch up, intending to pass. As they closed the distance, the figure remained ahead of them, always just out of clear sight, obscured slightly by the curve of the trail or the angle of the light. When they finally reached the spot where the figure should have been, the trail was empty. No one was there. No footprints marked the dusty path. David Brennan later described the experience as deeply unsettling, not because of fear, but because of the impossibility. The figure had been there. They had seen it clearly. And then it was not there, with no explanation for where it had gone. By 2010, Olympic National Park had received at least 12 separate reports of similar encounters on the Spruce Railroad Trail. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Witnesses saw a solitary figure walking the trail, always moving slowly, always wearing gray or neutral-colored clothing. The figure never acknowledged greetings or warnings. It never turned to look at those approaching, and when witnesses overtook it or looked away briefly, it vanished. One detail recurred in nearly every account. No one could clearly describe the figure's face, Witnesses reported seeing a person, human in shape and size, but when asked to provide details, they struggled. Some said the figure's head was turned slightly away. Others said the light had been poor or that distance had prevented clear observation. But none could recall facial features, gender, or age with any certainty. A park ranger named Laura Strand began collecting reports systematically in 2011. She interviewed witnesses, documented their accounts, and plotted the locations where encounters had occurred. The sightings clustered in a 1-mile section of trail between the Western Tunnel and the bridge over Devil's Punch Bowl, a deep inlet on the lake's north shore. The encounters occurred at different times of day, morning, afternoon, evening, and in different seasons. Weather conditions varied. The only constant was the figure itself, gray clothing, slow pace, no interaction, and sudden disappearance. Strand hiked the trail herself multiple times, hoping to encounter the figure. She never did, but she spoke with enough witnesses to be convinced that something unusual was occurring. Most were experienced hikers or cyclists, familiar with trail etiquette, and accustomed to encountering other users. None could explain what they had seen or why the figure behaved as it did. In May of 2013, a group of 4 cyclists riding together all saw the figure. They were traveling westbound in the late afternoon, riding in a staggered line. The lead cyclist, a man named Gregory Kowalski, spotted the figure ahead and called back to his companions. All 4 confirmed seeing it, a person in gray clothing walking steadily, facing away from them. They approached cautiously, slowing their pace. Kowalski called out. No response. The group moved to pass. As they drew alongside the figure, it vanished. One moment it was there, visible to all 4 riders. The next moment, the trail was empty. The cyclists stopped and searched the area. The trail at that point ran along a steep hillside, dense forest above, a sharp drop to the lake below. There was no place for a person to have gone without leaving the trail, and leaving the trail would have required pushing through thick undergrowth, which would have been audible. The cyclists heard nothing. They found no footprints, no disturbance in the vegetation, no sign that anyone had been there. Kowalski filed a detailed report with the Park Service. He included statements from all 4 riders, each describing the same experience. The Park Service acknowledged the report but took no action. There was no safety hazard, no injury, no evidence of criminal activity. The incident was logged and archived. Theories emerged. Some suggested the figure was a park employee conducting trail maintenance or wildlife surveys, though rangers stated that maintenance crews always worked in teams and wore high-visibility clothing. Others proposed that the figure was a local resident with permission to use the trail, though that did not explain the disappearances or the lack of acknowledgement. A more unsettling possibility was suggested by a psychologist consulted informally by Strand. He proposed that the witnesses were experiencing a form of shared hallucination or perceptual error, perhaps triggered by the monotony of the trail, the play of light through the forest, or the psychological expectation of encountering other users. But this theory struggled to account for the consistency of the descriptions across independent witnesses who had no prior knowledge of the phenomenon. In 2015, a journalist named Rebecca Montoya investigated the reports for a regional magazine. She hiked the trail multiple times, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed Park Service records. She found that at least 40 separate encounters had been reported since 2007, though park officials suspected the actual number was higher. As many witnesses likely did not file formal reports. Montoya also discovered something curious. The figure was always seen moving in the same direction, from east to west, from the direction of the dam toward the western trailhead. No one had ever reported seeing the figure walking eastbound. It moved along the trail as if following a fixed route, traveling in one direction only, regardless of the time of day or the direction of the witnesses. One witness, a woman named Iris Delgado, told Montoya that she had encountered the figure 3 separate times, over the course of 2 years, always in the same section of trail. Each time, the experience was identical. The figure appeared ahead, walked steadily, ignored her greetings, and vanished when she overtook it. Delgado said she no longer hiked that section of the trail alone, not because she feared harm, but because the experience left her deeply unsettled, a sense that she was walking through a space that was occupied by something she could not fully perceive. Olympic National Park conducted a trail assessment in 2016, ostensibly to evaluate maintenance needs and user safety. Rangers walked the entire length of the Spruce Railroad Trail, documenting conditions and noting any hazards. The report made no mention of the figure or the sightings, though one ranger involved in the assessment later said off the record that the section between the tunnel and the bridge had an unusual quality, not threatening but noticeably different, as if the air were thicker or the light slightly off. No official explanation has been provided. The Park Service does not acknowledge the phenomenon in any public materials, and rangers are instructed not to discuss it with visitors unless directly asked. When asked, they typically suggest that witnesses have seen other trail users and that the disappearances are due to curves in the trail or momentary inattention. But the reports continue. In 2019, a cyclist named Julian Ortega encountered the figure on a clear morning in June. He described it as unmistakable, a person in gray clothing, walking alone, moving steadily westbound. He overtook the figure and glanced back. The trail was empty. In 2021, a hiker named Alicia Ruiz saw the same thing. Gray clothing, slow pace, no acknowledgement, sudden absence. In 2023, a group of 3 hikers encountered the figure together, all confirming the same details. The Spruce Railroad Trail remains open and well used. Families walk it, cyclists ride it. Photographers come to capture the views across Lake Crescent. Most see nothing unusual, but some, perhaps 1 in every 100 users, encounter the figure. They see it ahead of them, walking steadily westward, never responding, never stopping, always alone. And when they overtake it, it is gone, leaving no footprints in the dust, no sound of departure, no evidence that it was ever there, except the consistent, unshakable testimony of those who saw it and cannot explain what they saw. Water does not push upward with intention except in one place where it seems to. Deception Pass connects the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the waters of Puget Sound, separating Whidbey Island from Fidalgo Island in northwestern Washington. The pass is narrow, less than 500 feet at its tightest point, and the tidal currents that surge through it are among the strongest in North America, reaching speeds of 8 knots or more during peak flow. The water is cold, turbulent, and treacherous. Recreational boaters are advised to time their passages carefully, and even experienced mariners treat the pass with respect. The area has been known for centuries as difficult and dangerous. The Samish and Swinomish peoples navigated these waters long before European contact, and their oral traditions describe the pass as a place of power, where the ocean and the sound meet with violence. Captain George Vancouver named it Deception Pass in 1792, noting that what appeared to be a bay was in fact a narrow, dangerous channel. The first bridge across the pass was completed in 1935, a graceful steel structure that remains a landmark. Beneath the surface, the pass is a maze of rock formations, drop-offs, and surge channels. Visibility is often poor due to silt and plankton. Diving here is considered advanced-level work, attempted only by those with experience in strong currents and cold water. Most recreational divers avoid it entirely. But for those who do dive the pass, there is a section, unmarked on any chart, where the water behaves in a way that should not be possible. The first documented report came from a U.S. Navy dive team conducting underwater survey work in June of 1979. The team was mapping the seafloor near the western entrance to the pass, assessing structural integrity of the bridge foundations, and documenting potential navigation hazards. The work was routine, part of ongoing maintenance operations conducted by the Naval Undersea Warfare Center. On June 12th, a diver named Chief Petty Officer Vincent Holloway descended to approximately 60 feet to inspect a section of bedrock. He later reported in his dive log that while working near a specific set of coordinates, approximately 400 feet west of the bridge's north pier, he experienced an unusual sensation. He described it as a pulling force, directional and persistent, oriented upward. It was not buoyancy. Holloway was properly weighted, and his buoyancy compensator was functioning normally. The force felt external, as if something were tugging him toward the surface. Holloway tested his equipment, checked his gauges, and adjusted his position. The sensation persisted. He swam laterally, moving away from the coordinates. The force diminished. He returned to the same spot. The force resumed. He completed his inspection and surfaced, noting the experience in his report. The dive supervisor, a lieutenant named Gregory Strand, reviewed Holloway's account and instructed another team member, Petty Officer Marcus Delacroix, to dive the same coordinates the following day. Delacroix reported the identical experience, a distinct upward pulling force, localized to a specific area of the seafloor, strong enough to require active swimming to maintain depth. The Navy team conducted additional tests over the next week. Multiple divers confirmed the phenomenon. The force was present at depths between 50 and 80 feet, within a roughly circular area approximately 100 feet in diameter. It was not constant. Its intensity seemed to vary, though no pattern could be determined. Some divers described it as gentle, requiring only minor adjustment to maintain position. Others reported a force strong enough to pull them upward several feet if they stopped actively swimming downward. The Navy's final report, completed in July of 1979, documented the anomaly and recommended that the area be marked as a potential hazard for underwater operations. The report was classified and filed. No public announcement was made. No navigational warnings were issued. The coordinates were noted in internal Navy dive planning documents, and teams were advised to avoid the area when possible. The phenomenon might have remained unknown outside military circles if not for civilian dive operators who began exploring Deception Pass in the early 1980s. As recreational technical diving grew in popularity, a handful of experienced divers began attempting the challenging conditions of the pass. Among them was a dive instructor named Patricia Vega, who operated a small charter business out of Anacortes. In August of 1983, Vega was guiding two advanced divers on an exploratory dive near the bridge. At approximately 65 feet, one of her clients, a man named David Kowalski, signaled distress. Vega approached and found him struggling to maintain depth, finning vigorously downward but still drifting upward. She checked his equipment. Everything was functioning normally. She guided him away from the area, and the problem ceased. Both divers surfaced safely, but Kowalski described the experience as deeply unsettling. He had felt as if something were physically lifting him, overriding his efforts to descend. Vega mentioned the incident to other local dive operators. Several acknowledged having experienced or heard of similar phenomena in the same general area. One operator, a former Navy diver named Thomas Milliken, confirmed that the Navy had documented an upward force near the western entrance to the pass and that the area was quietly avoided by military dive teams. By the late 1980s, the location had acquired a nickname among local divers, the Lift Zone. It was not marked on charts, not listed in dive guides, and not officially acknowledged by any agency, but experienced divers knew about it, and most chose to avoid it. Those who dove it described the same experience, a persistent upward force, localized and inexplicable, that required constant effort to resist. In 1992, a marine biologist named Dr. Evelyn Ruiz conducted a study of benthic communities in Deception Pass. During her research, she dove the lift zone and experienced the phenomenon firsthand. Ruiz was an experienced scientific diver with hundreds of logged dives. She described the force as unambiguous and directional, unlike any buoyancy or current effect she had encountered. She attempted to measure it using a spring scale attached to a weighted line, but the results were inconclusive. The turbulent conditions and strong tidal currents made precise measurement impossible. Ruiz consulted with oceanographers and hydrodynamic specialists. The consensus was that the phenomenon was likely related to upwelling, cold water rising from depth due to pressure differentials or seafloor topography. But upwelling typically affected large areas and produced gentle, diffuse currents, not the localized, forceful sensation described by divers. And upwelling did not explain why the force was strongest at mid-depth rather than near the surface. Another theory proposed that the force was a hydraulic effect created by water flowing over submerged rock formations, generating lift similar to an airplane wing. But the seafloor in the lift zone was relatively flat, with no structures that would produce such an effect. And the force persisted even during slack tide, when currents were minimal. In 1997, a team from the University of Washington's Applied Physics Laboratory attempted to study the phenomenon using remote sensors and underwater cameras. They deployed equipment in the lift zone during a period of calm weather and slack tide. The instruments recorded normal water movement, normal temperature gradients, and normal pressure readings. There was no measurable upward current, no anomaly in the data. Yet divers who entered the water at the same time reported feeling the upward force as strongly as ever. One member of the research team, a graduate student named Helena Strand, noted in her field report that the disconnect between subjective experience and objective measurement was itself significant. She wrote, "Either the divers are experiencing a sensory illusion, unlikely given the consistency of reports across independent witnesses, or the force operates through a mechanism our instruments cannot detect." The lift zone remains undocumented in official navigational charts and recreational dive guides. The Washington State Park System, which manages underwater parks in the area, does not acknowledge the phenomenon. The U.S. Coast Guard has no record of it. The Navy's 1979 report remains classified, and requests for its release under the Freedom of Information Act have been denied, with officials citing operational security. Local dive operators continue to advise clients quietly. When asked about good dive sites near Deception Pass, they recommend areas away from the western entrance. If pressed, some will mention the lift zone, describing it as a spot with weird currents or an area where buoyancy gets tricky. They do not explain further, and most clients do not ask. In 2009, a technical diver named Julian Ortega deliberately dove the lift zone to document it. He carried multiple depth gauges, a dive computer, and an underwater camera. At 62 feet, he felt the upward force. His gauges showed stable depth, proper weighting, and normal buoyancy. Yet he had to fin continuously to avoid rising. He tested by stopping all movement. Slowly, despite being properly weighted, he began to drift upward. He descended again, finning hard, and filmed the experience. The video showed nothing unusual, just a diver working to maintain position in murky water. But Ortega's commentary, recorded on the surface afterward, was clear. "Something down there is pulling you up. I don't know what it is, but it's real, and it's strong." No definitive explanation has been provided. The lift zone persists, unmarked and officially unacknowledged, in the waters west of Deception Pass. Divers who enter it feel the upward force and must work to resist it. Those who stop finning drift slowly toward the surface, pulled by something that instruments cannot measure, and that no theory of hydrodynamics adequately explains. And every few years, someone dives the area for the first time, feels the pull, and surfaces with the same confused certainty. The water there is pushing them upward, gently but insistently, as if something beneath the surface is trying to return them to the air above. Nature does not draw circles, except in one valley where it has, for reasons no one can explain. Sol Duc Valley lies in the western interior of Olympic National Park, carved by the Sol Duc River as it descends from the high country toward the Pacific coast. The valley is narrow, forested with old-growth Douglas fir, western hemlock, and Sitka spruce. Annual rainfall exceeds 140 inches, creating an ecosystem of extraordinary density. Moss hangs from every branch, ferns carpet the forest floor, and fallen trees decompose slowly beneath layers of vegetation. The area has been protected since Olympic National Park was established in 1938, and human presence is limited to trails and a small developed area near Sol Duc Hot Springs. The Quileute people have inhabited the region for thousands of years. Their oral traditions describe Sol Duc Valley as a place of power, where the forest is older and deeper than elsewhere. European explorers arrived in the late 19th century, drawn by timber and later by the hot springs, which became a modest resort destination. The valley itself remained largely unexplored, dense, remote, and difficult to traverse. Aerial photography of Olympic National Park began in 1934 as part of a United States Geological Survey project to map the newly proposed national park boundaries. The photographs were taken from low-flying aircraft, capturing the forested landscape in black and white. Most images showed the expected terrain, unbroken forest, rivers, ridgelines. But one photograph, taken on August 9, 1934, showed something unusual in Sol Duc Valley. A circular clearing, pale against the dark canopy, approximately 200 feet in diameter. The photographer, a surveyor named William Thatcher, noted the feature in his flight log, but assumed it was a natural meadow or the site of an old fire. The photograph was filed with thousands of others, and the circle was not remarked upon again until 1957, when the Park Service conducted a new aerial survey. The 1957 photographs showed the circle still present, unchanged in size or position. A park resource manager named Vincent Holloway reviewed both sets of images and noted that the clearing had not grown, shifted, or filled in over 23 years. This was unusual. Natural clearings in temperate rainforests typically show some change over 2 decades. Encroaching vegetation, erosion, the emergence of pioneer species. The circle in Sol Duc Valley showed none of these. Its boundary remained sharp, its interior bare. Holloway requested a ground expedition to investigate. In July of 1958, a team of 3 park rangers hiked into the valley to locate and document the circle. The lead ranger, a man named Gregory Strand, used the aerial photographs and topographic maps to navigate to the approximate coordinates. After a day of difficult travel through dense forest, the team found it. The circle was exactly as it appeared in the photographs. A nearly perfect clearing, approximately 200 feet in diameter, situated on a gentle slope in the middle of unbroken forest. The boundary was abrupt. Trees grew right up to the edge, then stopped. There was no gradual transition, no zone of stunted growth or sparse vegetation. Inside the circle, the ground was bare soil, covered with a thin layer of moss and scattered debris, fallen branches, leaves, but no living plants. Strand and his team spent several hours documenting the site. They measured the diameter at multiple points and found it consistent, 203 feet on average, with minimal variation. The circle was not quite perfect, but it was far more regular than any natural feature should be. They examined the soil, finding it unremarkable, typical forest soil, rich in organic matter, moist and well-drained. They searched for evidence of past human activity, stumps, tool marks, fire scars, and found none. The center of the circle contained no feature that might explain it. No rock outcropping, no depression, no water source. Strand's report, filed in August of 1958, described the circle as anomalous but not hazardous and recommended periodic monitoring. He proposed several possible explanations. The site might be an old homestead clearing, though no records existed of settlement in that part of the valley. It might be the result of a localized fire, though the soil showed no charcoal or heat damage. It might be a natural meadow maintained by unusual soil chemistry or hydrology, though testing showed nothing abnormal. The circle remained undisturbed and largely forgotten until 1973, when Olympic National Park conducted another aerial survey using color photography. The circle was still there, unchanged. A resource ecologist named Dr. Patricia Vega reviewed the images and compared them to the 1934 and 1957 photographs. The circle had not shifted, grown, or eroded over 39 years. Its dimensions were identical. Its boundary remained sharp. Vega organized a second ground expedition in September of 1973. She brought soil samples, took core samples from trees at the circle's edge, and documented the site photographically. Her findings, published in an internal Park Service report, were puzzling. The soil inside the circle was healthy and fertile, indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. The trees at the edge were mature, showing no signs of disease or stress. There was no physical barrier preventing tree growth into the circle, no bedrock, no toxic substances, no compacted soil. Yet no vegetation had established itself there. Vega tested whether seeds could germinate in the circle's soil. She collected soil from inside the circle and from the surrounding forest, brought both samples to a greenhouse, and planted identical seeds in each. The seeds in the forest soil germinated and grew normally. The seeds in the circle soil also germinated and grew normally. The soil itself was not the problem. She returned to the circle in 1974 and attempted an experiment. She planted a dozen Douglas fir seedlings inside the circle, spacing them evenly across the clearing. She watered them, protected them from browsing animals, and monitored their progress over the next year. All 12 seedlings died within 6 months. Autopsies showed no disease, no pest damage, no obvious cause of death. They had simply failed to thrive. By the 1980s, the circle had attracted attention from a small number of scientists and researchers interested in unexplained ecological phenomena. A botanist named Dr. Raymond Kowalski visited the site in 1981 and conducted extensive studies. He confirmed Vega's findings. The soil was healthy, the site received adequate sunlight and rainfall, and there was no measurable factor preventing plant growth. Yet nothing grew there. Kowalski proposed a novel theory. The circle might be maintained by subsurface water flow or unusual drainage patterns that prevented root establishment. But hydrological surveys found no evidence of this. The water table was consistent with the surrounding area, and drainage was normal. Another researcher, Dr. Evelyn Ruiz, suggested in 1987 that the circle might be the site of an ancient structure or burial mound, which had altered the soil in ways that persisted long after the structure itself had eroded. But archaeological surveys found no artifacts, no evidence of human modification, and no subsurface features. A geologist named Dr. Marcus Delacroix examined the site in 1992, searching for geological explanations: a buried lava tube, a mineralized zone, a fault line. He found nothing. The bedrock beneath the circle was identical to the surrounding area. There was no geological reason for the clearing to exist or persist. Olympic National Park conducted its most recent aerial survey in 2018 using high-resolution satellite imagery and LiDAR technology. The circle was still present, unchanged in size or shape. Comparison with the 1934 photograph showed that the boundary had not shifted by more than a few feet in 84 years. The precision was remarkable. Natural clearings drift, expand, and contract over decades. The circle in Sol-Duc Valley had done none of these things. A computational analysis conducted in 2019 measured the circle's deviation from a perfect geometric circle. The result? Less than 3% variation. For a natural feature 200 feet in diameter, this was statistically improbable. Perfect circles do not occur in nature without a central point of origin, a tree, a rock, a water source around which symmetry can form. The Sol-Duc circle had no such center. Park officials have never restricted access to the circle, but they do not publicize its location. It is not marked on trail maps, not mentioned in visitor guides, and not included in ranger-led programs. A few researchers and curious hikers make the difficult trek to see it, but most visitors to Sol-Duc Valley never know it exists. In 2021, a photographer named Julian Ortega hiked to the circle and documented it extensively. He took measurements using a laser rangefinder and confirmed the dimensions reported in earlier studies. He also noted something not mentioned in previous reports: the silence. Inside the circle, ambient forest sounds, bird calls, wind in the trees, the distant rush of the river were noticeably muted. The effect was subtle but consistent. Ortega recorded audio inside and outside the circle. The difference was measurable. Sound levels inside the circle were approximately 15% lower than in the surrounding forest, with no obvious acoustic explanation. No further studies are planned. Olympic National Park acknowledges the circle's existence, but offers no explanation. The site is monitored periodically to ensure it remains stable, but no active research is being conducted. Officials describe it as a natural curiosity, though privately, some admit they have no idea what maintains it or why it persists. The circle remains 200 feet in diameter, bare and unchanging, in a valley where everything else grows with relentless vigor. Trees rise to the edge and stop, as if obeying a rule older than the forest itself. And in the center of the clearing, where some feature should exist to explain the symmetry, there is only bare ground, moss, and silence. A perfect circle drawn by no hand, maintained by no visible force, enduring without purpose or explanation in a place where nature should long ago have erased it.